Hey, welcome back. If you are new here, I am really glad you found this channel, and if you have been with me for a while, you already know that we do not rush things here. We take our time, we slow down, and tonight we're going to travel somewhere you have probably never thought about before. Close your eyes for just a second and picture this a freezing cold night in Northern Europe, maybe 800 or 900 years ago. There is no heater, no thermostat on the wall, no warm air quietly humming through a vent somewhere. Just cold. And the only thing standing between you and the darkness is a small pile of burning wood sitting right in the middle of your dirt floor. And the smoke. Oh, the smoke just goes everywhere. Here is what I find remarkable. The story of how humans in Europe learned to heat their homes is not just an engineering story. It is a story about power, about beauty, about the desperate need for comfort, and about how something as simple as a fire on the floor shaped the way entire civilizations were built. And somewhere in the middle of all of that history, there is a civilization that actually figured it all out perfectly nearly 2,000 years ago. And then the world forgot about it for 1,000 years. So tonight let us start at the very beginning. Long before anyone in Europe had ever heard of a chimney, long before there was such a thing as a fireplace with a mantel or carved stone or anything decorative at all, people were just cold, deeply, relentlessly, existentially cold. And here is something I think we forget when we read about ancient history. We tend to picture the past through paintings and illustrations, grand castles, fur-lined cloaks, dramatic torchlight. But the actual physical experience of being cold in a northern European winter, without a single piece of modern insulation, without wool insulation in the walls, without double-pane windows, that cold was not a minor inconvenience. It was a threat to your life. Historians and archaeologists have pieced together what early European homes looked like during the Iron Age and the early medieval period, and the picture is genuinely humbling. Most ordinary people, farmers, craftspeople. The vast majority of the population lived in what we would now call longhouses. These were low rectangular structures with walls made of wattle and daub, which is basically a mixture of woven sticks and mud. The roof was thatched bundles of dried grass or reeds layered on top of each other, and somewhere near the centre of the floor there was a fire. Not a fireplace, not a stove, just a fire on the ground. There was no chimney. There was no designated place for the smoke to escape. The smoke just rose up into the dark space above the rafters and slowly, very slowly seeped out through the thatch, through the gaps in the roof, through whatever crack it could find. And in the meantime, everyone inside was breathing that smoke. I want you to sit with that image for a moment because I think we tend to romanticize it. Gathering around the fire sounds cozy, right? Warm, communal. But archaeologists who have actually experimented with living in reconstructed Iron Age homes, spending real nights inside these structures with a central fire burning, have described it as something between unpleasant and genuinely alarming. Your eyes burn within minutes. The air is thick and heavy. The smell of wood smoke soaks into everything you own, everything you eat. After a few hours, breathing becomes uncomfortable. And this was not an occasional thing. This was every single night from October to April, year after year, for an entire lifetime. There is a reason why skeletal remains from early medieval populations in Northern Europe sometimes show signs of chronic respiratory inflammation. Scientists studying oxidative stress markers in ancient bones and tissues have found evidence consistent with what you would expect from a lifetime of indoor smoke exposure. These people were not living with a rustic fireplace. They were living inside what modern safety standards would classify as a serious health hazard. So why did they do it? Why not just design a better system? And here is where it gets interesting, because the answer is not that they were not intelligent. The answer is that a central hearth was actually one of the most rational solutions available, given the building materials and skills they had. A centrally placed fire distributes heat in every direction simultaneously. It warms the people sitting around it, it warms the walls, it keeps the structural timbers of the roof dry, which actually helps preserve the building. It was multi-purpose. It was cooking, it was heating, it was light. It was the social center of the home all in one place. The problem was the smoke, and the solutions people came up with are genuinely creative. One of the most widespread solutions and one of my favorite forgotten pieces of architectural history was something called a louver. Not the kind of louver you might picture on a window shutter. This was a chimney substitute, a kind of lantern-shaped wooden structure built into the very top of the roof directly above the central fire. It had angled slats or boards arranged so that rain and snow could not fall through, but smoke could drift out. You could even pull on ropes to partially close or open it like a very primitive thermostat. When the fire was burning hot and producing a lot of smoke, you would open the louver. When the fire had burned down to glowing charcoal and was producing more heat and less smoke, you would close it to hold the warmth inside. It is elegant in its own way, a low-tech system for managing the trade-off between heat and air quality, designed by people who had no engineering degree, no manual, no model to copy. Just observation, trial, and probably a lot of smoky evenings before they figured it out. Wealthier households sometimes used metal braziers, portable containers made of iron or bronze where you could burn charcoal. Charcoal burns much cleaner than raw wood. It produces less visible smoke. You could move a brazier from room to room. The Romans actually used them extensively in their townhouses, and the practice filtered into the homes of wealthy Europeans throughout the early medieval period. But charcoal was expensive to produce and required preparation in advance. It was a luxury solution, not a practical one for most families, and here is something that surprises a lot of people when they first hear it, a genuine survival strategy used in Northern Europe during the coldest months of winter. Families did not just share their homes with each other, they shared their homes with their animals, cows, goats, pigs. The animals were brought inside at night, or the family slept in the barn section of a longhouse that was specifically designed with both human and animal quarters under one roof. Now I know that sounds uncomfortable to modern ears. It sounds like poverty, like desperation. But here is the thing. A cow is essentially a large, slow-burning furnace. The body heat generated by even a handful of large animals in an enclosed space can raise the indoor temperature by several degrees. In a climate where the difference between 6 degrees and 10 degrees Celsius might be the difference between survival and frostbite, that is not a trivial contribution. It was smart. It was practical. It was the kind of unglamorous, effective logic that people living close to the edge of survival learn very quickly. There is even a specific type of Scandinavian farmhouse architecture called the longhouse, where the living quarters and the animal barn were connected by a shared wall, precisely to take advantage of the residual heat from the livestock. Archaeologists have found these structures across Iceland, Norway and Denmark, some of them dating back over 1,000 years. The design is not an accident. It is intentional thermal engineering just without any equations. When I think about all of this, the louvers, the shared walls with animals, the constant trade-off between warmth and breathable air, I feel a kind of deep respect for these people. Not pity, respect, because they were solving genuinely hard problems with limited resources, and their solutions, while imperfect, kept entire populations alive through centuries of brutal winters. But there is one more piece of this story that I think is underappreciated, and it is the emotional dimension. In a home without any private heating, no individual bedroom heater, no warm bathroom, no cozy corner, where you could sit alone in the warmth, the fire was not just physical. It was psychological. It was the gathering point of the family. Every conversation, every meal, every story told in the evening, every moment of laughter or grief or quiet thought, all of it happened around that fire. The fire was not in the home. In a very real sense, the fire was the home. Everything else was just structure built around it. There is a reason that in Old English the word for hearth and the word for home are deeply intertwined. There is a reason that almost every early European mythology has some version of a fire goddess, a hearth deity, a spirit of the flame that needed to be respected and maintained. The Greeks had Hestia, the Romans had Vesta, the ancient Germanic tribes had Holder. These were not arbitrary choices. The fire was so central to survival, so non-negotiable, that people built entire belief systems around the obligation to maintain it. In ancient Greece, and this detail always stops me in my tracks, when a woman got married, her mother would carry a flame from the family hearth to the new home of the bride and groom, not as a symbolic gesture in a modern poetic sense, as a literal continuation of fire. The idea was that the flame of the family continued into the next generation, that the hearth of the parents lived on in the hearth of the children, and if that flame ever went out, if the bride let the household fire die, it was considered a terrible omen, not just bad luck, a sign of neglect, of disrespect toward the family, toward the gods, toward the very idea of home. Think about that. In a world where fire was the only reliable source of warmth and light, and cooked food, letting the hearth die was not just careless. It was a kind of abandonment of everything the home stood for. We've been living with central heating and electric stoves for so long that it is almost impossible to imagine what that felt like. To have one fire, one source, one living, breathing, hungry thing in the middle of your house that you had to keep alive. And yet, for most of human history, and for most of European history specifically, that is exactly what people had. No chimney, no flue, no warm air quietly circulating through ducts, just a pile of burning wood on a dirt floor, a hole in the roof, and the patience to endure the smoke. That is where this story begins. And what makes the next chapter so astonishing is that it took one civilization, one extraordinary, obsessive, engineering-addicted civilization to look at all of that discomfort and say, we can do so much better than this. The Romans did not just improve heating. They invented something so sophisticated, so ahead of its time, that when their empire collapsed, the technology essentially vanished from European life for nearly 1,000 years. And what they built hidden under the floors of their bathhouses and their villas, invisible to anyone who did not know where to look, is one of the most quietly remarkable achievements in the history of home design. That is where we're going next. So let me take you underground for a moment. Not metaphorically, literally underground. Imagine you're standing in the basement of a Roman villa somewhere in what is now southern England, maybe around the year 150 of the Common Era. The Roman Empire is at the height of its power, and beneath your feet, hidden under a raised floor supported by hundreds of small clay pillars, there is something breathing, something warm. Hot air is moving through a network of channels circulating silently and visibly, rising up through hollow tiles built into the walls and radiating outward into every room above you. The floor you're standing on is not cold stone, it is warm to the touch, and no one upstairs is coughing from smoke. Because there is no smoke upstairs. This is the hypocaust. And the first time I really understood how it worked, not just intellectually but viscerally, I genuinely had to sit down for a second. Because it is not just impressive for its time, it is impressive full stop. 2,000 years later, the basic principle behind this system is still the foundation of modern underfloor heating. The word itself comes from the ancient Greek hypo, meaning under, and kaustos, meaning burned, heat from below, that is it. That is the whole idea stated in 2 words. But the engineering behind those 2 words is extraordinary. Here is how it actually worked. The construction began with the ground floor of a building, whether a public bath, a private villa, or a military barracks. Instead of laying the floor directly on the earth, Roman engineers and builders raised it. They built hundreds of small square pillars called pili stacks out of ceramic tiles and mortar spaced roughly 2 feet apart across the entire floor area. Each pillar was about 2 feet tall. Then across the tops of all these pillars they laid large flat tiles followed by a layer of concrete, followed by the final decorative floor marble mosaic polished stone. So now you have a floor that is solid and beautiful from above, but underneath there is an entire hidden cavity, a continuous open space running below every room in the building. And this cavity connects through a series of channels to a furnace located outside the main building or in a separate utility room. The furnace had a name too, the prefurnium. It burned wood constantly, and I do mean constantly. Someone's entire job was to stand next to that furnace and keep it fed. When the fire burned, it generated hot air. That hot air had nowhere to go but forward into the underfloor cavity. It moved through the space beneath the raised floor, heating the floor from below. And then here is the really elegant part. It was channeled upward through hollow rectangular tiles built into the walls. These wall tiles, called caliducts, essentially turned the walls themselves into radiators. The heat rose through the floor, travelled up through the walls, and eventually escaped through vents near the ceiling or through the roof. Every surface in the room, floor walls, even the ceiling in some designs was warm. No open flame inside the living space, no smoke, no fire risk inside the room, just gentle, even radiant warmth coming from every direction. Now I want to pause here and ask you something, because I think about this a lot. If you visited a friend's house today and the floors were warm, the walls were warm, and there was no visible heater anywhere, you would probably think that was a fairly upscale modern home. You might think about hydronic underfloor heating, the kind of thing you find in Scandinavian homes or high-end renovations. You would think this person invested in something genuinely comfortable. The Romans were doing exactly this, nearly 2,000 years ago. Vitruvius, the Roman architect and engineer who wrote one of the most important architectural manuals in history, De Architectura, around 15 before the Common Era, described the hypocaust system in precise technical detail. He wrote about how to calculate the positioning of rooms based on their desired temperature. He recommended that the hottest rooms, the caldarium or hot bath, should be placed directly above or adjacent to the furnace. The warm room, the tepidarium, should be farther away. The cool room, the frigidarium, farthest of all. It was a deliberate thermal gradient engineered room by room, and he had thoughts about efficiency too. He suggested that the caldarium for men and the caldarium for women should be built back to back, sharing a wall so that a single furnace could heat both. Economy of fuel, efficiency of design. The man was thinking like a modern building engineer. The scale of these systems, once you start looking at the archaeological evidence, becomes genuinely staggering. The baths of Caracalla in Rome, completed around 217 of the Common Era, could accommodate somewhere between 1,500 and possibly up to 8,000 bathers per day, depending on which historian you read. The entire complex was heated by a hypocaust system that required a dedicated team of workers, almost certainly enslaved people, to tend the furnaces around the clock. Calculations based on the size of the furnaces and the known burning rates of wood suggest that keeping those baths running at full temperature required something in the range of 114 tons of wood per year for a single large installation. 114 tons, just to keep the floors warm. That number tells you two things simultaneously: how effective the system was, and how labour-intensive and resource-heavy it was to operate. The hypocaust was not a system for everyone. In public baths, the cost was covered communally. Roman citizens paid a small admission fee, and the baths were also often subsidised by wealthy patrons or by the state itself as a form of public goodwill. But in private villas, a hypocaust was an unmistakable statement of wealth and status. Only the affluent merchant class and the aristocracy could afford the construction cost, the constant fuel supply, and the labour required to maintain it. The remains of hypocaust systems have been found across the entire span of the former Roman Empire in Italy, in France, in Spain, in Germany, in Switzerland, in North Africa, and extensively throughout Britain. The Romans pushed north into climates that were genuinely cold and inhospitable, and they brought their heating technology with them. At the Roman town of Aquae Sulis, what we call Bath today in southwest England, the hypocaust system beneath the Great Bath complex is still partially visible to visitors. You can walk through the museum and look down through glass panels at the original pilly stack still standing after nearly 2,000 years. The sight of those neat rows of little ceramic columns still holding up the memory of a floor that was once warm is one of those quietly affecting historical moments that I find difficult to describe properly. There is something about seeing the actual physical evidence, not a diagram, not a reconstruction, but the real thing that makes the past suddenly feel very close. I visited Bath some years ago, and I remember standing over those pili and thinking, someone designed this. Someone worked out the mathematics of heat transfer and airflow and structural load without a calculator, without a computer, without any of our modern engineering tools, and they got it right. So right that it is still standing. But here is the part of this story that I find genuinely heartbreaking. When the Roman Empire began its long decline in the western provinces, a process that accelerated dramatically through the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era, the hypocaust did not just fall out of fashion. It was lost, not gradually redesigned into something better, not replaced by a superior technology, just abandoned, forgotten, as Roman authority withdrew from Britain, from Gaul, from the Germanic territories. The complex supply chains and specialized labor pools that had made the hypocaust possible simply ceased to exist. The skilled builders who knew how to construct the pili stacks, how to lay the caladuct tiles, how to design the furnace and calculate the airflow, that knowledge was not written down in any accessible, widely distributed form. It lived in the heads of specialists, and when the civilization that supported these specialists collapsed, the knowledge went with it. One historian has estimated that in Britain, specifically from approximately the year 400 of the Common Era until roughly the year 1900, a span of 1500 years, central heating essentially did not exist for ordinary people, not in any form comparable to what the Romans had enjoyed. Hot baths became rare. Warm floors became a distant memory preserved only in the ruins that dotted the landscape and which nobody quite understood. Think about that timeline. 1500 years. The people of medieval England walked past the ruins of Roman villas. They saw the stones, the remnants of mosaic floors, the strange raised foundations, and in many cases they had no idea what they were looking at. They called some of these sites giants' work because the construction seemed too sophisticated, too organized to have been made by ordinary human hands. The technology was so far beyond what they were capable of producing that they assumed supernatural origins. That detail, more than almost anything else in this story, illustrates the true magnitude of what was lost when Rome fell. It was not just political power or military organization. It was technical knowledge, practical daily life improving knowledge, the knowledge of how to stay warm without breathing smoke. Now, to be fair and precise here, because I think the history deserves precision, The hypocaust did not disappear completely from all of Europe at once. In the Eastern Roman Empire, what we call the Byzantine Empire, sophisticated heating systems continued to be used in bathhouses and some wealthy buildings for centuries after the Western collapse. And there is genuinely fascinating historical research suggesting that in certain monasteries in Germany and Central Europe, a form of heat storage hypocaust survived into the medieval period. Monks who were among the few people in medieval Europe who consistently maintained libraries and technical knowledge preserved a version of underfloor heating in their calefactories' warming rooms, where a single firing of a furnace beneath a pile of granite stones could keep a room warm for days. In Poland, some variations of this system reportedly survived in use until the 18th and 19th centuries. So the story is not a clean, sudden erasure. It is more like a slow dimming knowledge becoming rarer, more specialized, concentrated in fewer and fewer places until for most people in most of Europe, it might as well have been gone entirely. And while all of this was happening, while the memory of Roman engineering was fading from everyday life, the people of medieval Europe had to find their own answers to the same ancient problem. The problem that has not changed at all since the first human family huddled inside a cave. How do you stay warm when the world outside is trying to freeze you? Their answer was simpler than Rome's, cruder, smokier. And here is what I find fascinating, in some ways more communal, more human, more intimate. It involved going back to the fire, back to the flame in the middle of the room, back to the smoke and the smell and the gathering and the warmth. But they were about to make one invention, just one, that would change everything. An invention so obvious in hindsight that it is almost funny that it took so long to figure out. An invention that would not just change how people heated their homes, but how they designed their homes, how they thought about privacy, how they structured their families, and in a very real way how they conceived of what a home even was. I am talking about the chimney, and the story of how the chimney arrived in Europe, who had it first, who refused it longest, and what happened to society when it became common is stranger and more interesting than almost anything you might expect. All right, so where were we? We left off with a question hanging in the air, the chimney. That one invention that in hindsight seems almost embarrassingly obvious. A tube, a vertical tube, to let the smoke out. And yet, and I genuinely love this about history, it took most of Europe somewhere between 500 and 800 years after the fall of Rome to figure out how to build one properly and put it to widespread use in ordinary homes, which honestly, if you think about how many cold, smoky winters that represents, is a little bit stunning. But before we get to the chimney itself, I want to spend some time with the world it arrived into. Because the medieval home, the place that the chimney was about to transform, was not just architecturally different from what came before and after, it was psychologically different. The way people lived inside those spaces, the way they related to each other, the way they understood privacy and community and family, all of it, was shaped by the reality of having one shared source of heat and light. And that reality was defined above almost everything else by smoke. Picture a medieval great hall, not the Hollywood version, not the grand torchlit banquet hall with roaring fireplaces on every wall and dramatic shadows playing across stone arches. The real thing. The real medieval great hall in the 10th or 11th century was a single enormous room. The floor was packed earth or stone. The ceiling was high, sometimes open all the way to the underside of the thatched or tiled roof, because you needed that upper space to function as a kind of smoke reservoir. There were no ceilings as we think of them, no flat horizontal surfaces to trap the heat. Just the cavernous dark space above where smoke accumulated and slowly dissipated. In the centre of this hall, not against a wall, not in a corner but right in the middle of the floor, was the hearth. It was typically a raised platform of stone or clay, roughly circular, maybe 4 or 5 feet across. The fire burned directly on it, and above it in the ceiling or roof there was either a simple hole or one of those louver structures we talked about in the first part of this story. Everyone in the household, the lord and his family, the servants, the guests, sometimes the animals occupied this same space. They ate here, slept here, conducted business here, settled disputes here. The Great Hall was not a room in a house, it was the house. It was the entirety of domestic life concentrated into a single shared space, organised around a single shared fire. And here is what I find psychologically fascinating about that arrangement. There was essentially no such thing as privacy. Not in the way we understand it. Not in the way that feels instinctive to anyone alive today. The idea of going to your room, closing the door, having your own space with your own warmth that did not exist for most people. Even for the wealthy, even in relatively large households, the Great Hall was where life happened. Together, all of it. When historians talk about how the chimney changed European social history, they are not being dramatic. They are being accurate. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let us stay in the smoke for a little longer, because the health dimension of this story is something I think deserves much more attention than it usually gets. There is a remarkable piece of research that I keep returning to. A group of archaeologists and scientists ran a series of experiments using reconstructed Iron Age and early medieval buildings, accurate reconstructions built with period-appropriate materials and techniques. They recruited volunteers to actually live in these structures for extended periods, using a central open hearth as the sole heat and cooking source, just as medieval inhabitants would have. The results were not pretty. Within hours of sustained fire, the indoor air quality dropped to levels that modern occupational health standards would classify as hazardous. Particulate matter, the tiny particles produced by incomplete combustion of wood, reached concentrations significantly above what the World Health Organization considers safe for prolonged exposure. Carbon monoxide levels fluctuated dangerously depending on the airflow through the louver. The volunteers reported eye irritation, headaches, difficulty breathing. One participant described the experience as feeling like living inside a very slow-moving bonfire. And the researchers noted something particularly sobering. These were short-term experiments. Weeks, not years, not a lifetime. The people of medieval Europe were not doing this as an experiment. They were doing it from birth to death every winter, every year, with no period of recovery in clean air, no modern medical treatment for respiratory disease, no understanding of why they were chronically ill. Studies of skeletal remains from medieval populations in northern England and Scandinavia have found evidence of what researchers call chronic sinusitis lesions, damage to the sinus cavities consistent with prolonged exposure to smoke and particulate matter. Similar damage has been found in the remains of people from Viking-age settlements in Iceland and Denmark. These are not occasional individual cases. They appear widely enough across populations to suggest that respiratory inflammation was simply a normal feature of medieval life, a background condition that people probably did not even fully recognize as a condition, because everyone around them had it too. You did not know you were sick. You just knew that winters felt heavy, and your chest hurt and your eyes were always tired. You assumed that was just what winter felt like. That is one of the things that I find most quietly devastating about this period of history. Not the dramatic suffering, not plague, not famine, not warfare, but this slow, invisible daily erosion of health that nobody had the framework to even identify, let alone address. And yet, and this is the part that always brings me back from the darkness of it, people were not passive. They were not simply enduring this without trying to improve it. Throughout the medieval period across different regions of Europe, you can trace a persistent, creative, sometimes surprisingly effective effort to manage the smoke problem. People were experimenting, failing, trying again, and slowly, haltingly getting somewhere. The first significant architectural response to the smoke problem before the true chimney was the smoke hood or smoke canopy. The idea was simple. Instead of letting the smoke from a central hearth drift upward and fill the entire room before finding its way out through the roof, you built a large funnel-shaped structure directly above the fire. This hood, typically made of wattle and daub or sometimes plaster over a wooden frame, would catch the smoke close to its source and direct it more efficiently toward an opening in the roof or wall. The problem was obvious. The hood had to be high enough above the fire not to catch fire itself, and if it was high enough above the fire not to catch fire, it was not particularly efficient at catching smoke. The margins were tight, and fires in smoke hoods were a recurring hazard. Medieval building records, and there are more of these surviving than most people realize, particularly from English monastic institutions, contain references to fires caused by damaged or poorly constructed smoke hoods, with a frequency that suggests this was an accepted occupational hazard of having a warm house. But the smoke hood was important as a conceptual step. It was the first time European builders began thinking about directing smoke rather than just tolerating it. It planted the idea that the relationship between fire and air could be managed, controlled, designed. And that idea led eventually to the chimney. Now here is where the history gets genuinely interesting, because the development of the chimney in medieval Europe was not a single invention by a single person in a single place. It was a slow convergence happening slightly differently in different regions, driven by different materials and different social pressures. The earliest examples of what we would recognize as a true built chimney, a vertical flue built into the structure of a wall carrying smoke from a wall-mounted fireplace to an outlet above the roofline, appear in northern France and England around the late 11th and early 12th centuries. And crucially, they appear first not in ordinary homes but in castles and stone manor houses. This matters. It matters a great deal, actually. The reason the chimney appeared first in stone buildings is partly structural. You need walls thick enough and strong enough to contain a flue, but it is also social. Stone buildings were expensive. They were built by the wealthy and the powerful, and the wealthy and the powerful had access to skilled masons, to imported building techniques possibly, to knowledge filtering in from areas where Roman building traditions had survived more continuously, like parts of Italy and southern France. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 is often cited by architectural historians as a significant catalyst for chimney development in English buildings. The Normans brought with them a tradition of stone castle building that included integrated fireplaces and rudimentary flues. Castles like the White Tower in London, built in the years following the conquest, include some of the earliest examples of wall fireplaces with chimney flues in English architecture. And here is what happened next. Here is the chain reaction that I find so elegant. Once you have a fireplace built into a wall, a fireplace with a chimney that actually removes the smoke from the room, you no longer need the entire household to gather in one enormous central hall. You can heat smaller rooms, individual rooms. You can put a fireplace in a chamber on the upper floor of a building with its own flue running up through the wall, and that room can be warm and habitable independently of the great hall below. Suddenly rooms become possible. And when rooms become possible, private life becomes possible. A lord can have a private chamber where he sleeps with his wife separate from the servants. A noblewoman can have her own sitting room. Guests can be given their own quarters rather than unrolling a blanket on the great hall floor. Children can have a nursery. Scholars and clergymen can have studies. The architectural historian Marc Girouard, who spent much of his career studying the development of the English country house, argued compellingly that the chimneyed fireplace was one of the primary drivers of what he called the privatization of domestic life in medieval Europe, the slow withdrawal from communal living toward the compartmentalized individual room-by-room organization of space that we consider completely natural today. We take for granted that a house has rooms for separate functions, for separate people, for separate moments of the day. That organization feels so obvious that it barely registers as a design choice. But it is a design choice, and the chimney is one of the main reasons it became the default. Now let me add a layer here, because I think this is where the story gets genuinely complex. The chimneyed fireplace was not an unmixed blessing. Not at all. The wool fireplace, the kind with a chimney, is actually significantly less efficient as a heat source than a central hearth. A central hearth radiates heat in every direction. It warms the air around it in a full 360-degree radius. A wall fireplace, by contrast, faces in only one direction. The heat it produces radiates primarily outward from its opening, and much of that heat goes straight up and out through the chimney before it ever warms the room. Historians and engineers who have studied this have estimated that a medieval wall fireplace, even a reasonably well-designed one, was converting only somewhere between 10 and 20% of its fuel into usable heat for the room. The rest went up the chimney. A central hearth, for all its horrifying smoke, was probably closer to 30 or even 40% efficient by the same measure, so the chimney solved one enormous problem, the smoke, and in doing so created a different, quieter problem. It made heating dramatically less efficient. People needed more fuel to achieve the same warmth. Forests around populated areas of Europe came under increasing pressure as the demand for firewood grew. The 13th and 14th centuries saw significant deforestation in parts of England and France that historians have linked at least in part to the expanding use of wall fireplaces. There is a kind of historical irony in this that I find almost poetic. Humans figured out how to breathe more easily inside their homes, and the consequence was that they started running out of trees. But let me ask you something, because I am curious what you think. If you had been living in medieval Europe, no chimney, no wall fireplace, just a central hearth, and all that smoke, and someone offered you a trade better air quality, in exchange for less warmth and fewer trees, would you have taken it? I think most people would. I think the smoke was genuinely unbearable in ways that the efficiency statistics do not fully capture, and the historical record seems to confirm this. Once wall fireplaces and chimneys became available, once people had the choice, they spread extraordinarily quickly through the wealthier levels of society. By the 13th century, chimneys were standard in noble houses across France and England. By the 14th and 15th centuries, prosperous merchant families in towns and cities were incorporating them into their stone and timber frame houses. The desire to get the smoke out of the room was so powerful that people accepted higher fuel costs, accepted the engineering complexity, accepted the expense without much apparent hesitation. And as the chimney spread, something else happened. Something that the engineers and architects probably did not anticipate, and that tells you a great deal about human nature. The fireplace, now freed from the centre of the room, now built into a wall, now framed by stone or plaster, or carved wood, started to become something more than a heating appliance. It started to become a statement. And the story of what people did with that statement, how they turned a hole in a wall with a fire in it into one of the most powerful symbols of wealth status and artistic ambition in all of European history, that is a story about something much deeper than architecture. It is a story about what happens when a society starts to compete over comfort, when warmth becomes not just a necessity but a luxury, when the fire stops being about survival and starts being about who you are. And that story begins, not coincidentally, in the one era of European history most obsessed with beauty, with classical ideals, and with the breathtaking intersection of art and power. We are heading into the Renaissance, and things are about to get very beautiful, very ornate, and in terms of actual heating effectiveness, honestly a little bit ridiculous. There is a particular kind of beauty that only exists when people have too much money and not enough practical sense. and the Renaissance fireplace is without question one of the finest examples of that phenomenon in all of human history. I say that with complete affection, because the fireplaces that emerged across Europe between roughly the 14th and 16th centuries are genuinely some of the most breathtaking objects ever attached to a wall. Carved marble, gilded bronze, classical columns in miniature flanking an opening barely large enough to heat the room it occupied, mythological scenes rendered in exquisite relief, family crests, allegorical figures, entire philosophical statements carved in stone presiding over a fire that, and I cannot stress this enough, was often barely adequate to keep the people sitting nearest to it from shivering. But here is the thing. Here is what I keep coming back to every time I study this period. The Renaissance fireplace was never really about warmth. Not primarily. It was about something much more interesting, much more human, much more complicated than warmth. It was about identity. To understand what happened to the fireplace during the Renaissance, you have to understand the specific fever that gripped educated European society, particularly in Italy, then spreading northward through France, England, the Low Countries, and eventually most of the continent from roughly the mid-14th century onward. The Renaissance was at its core a love affair with antiquity, with the classical world of Greece and Rome, with the idea that the ancient civilizations had achieved something close to perfection in art, in architecture, in philosophy, in the organization of human life, and that the task of the present age was to recover, reimagine, and if possible, surpass that perfection. This was not merely an academic enthusiasm. It was felt physically, materially in the design of buildings and objects and spaces. Architects like Filippo Brunelleschi in Florence, Leon Battista Alberti in Rome, Andrea Palladio in the Veneto, these were men who studied Roman ruins with the intensity of detectives, measuring columns, sketching proportions, trying to decode the mathematical logic beneath the beauty. And what they discovered, or believed they discovered, was a system of harmony and proportion that could be applied to everything. Not just temples and public buildings, homes, rooms, and the objects within those rooms, including fireplaces. Now the Romans, as we discussed, had not used wall fireplaces. Their heating system, the hypocaust, was invisible. The Romans of the classical period did not in fact have mantelpieces or decorative fireplace surrounds in the Renaissance sense, because their fires were either hidden under floors or contained in small portable braziers. So here is a fascinating irony. Renaissance architects, in their passion for all things Roman, designed fireplaces in a style they believed was inspired by classical Rome, but classical Rome had never actually built fireplaces that way. They were essentially inventing a Roman aesthetic for a Roman technology that the Romans themselves had never particularly developed. It is a beautiful historical misunderstanding, and it produced some of the most extraordinary decorative objects in Western art. The mantelpiece, the framed surround of the fireplace opening, typically including a projecting shelf above, became the canvas on which the Renaissance artist and architect expressed their entire philosophical program. In the great palaces and villas of 15th century Florence, you see fireplace surrounds carved from pietra serena. The cool grey stone of Tuscany, in the spare, geometrically precise style that Brunelleschi had derived from his study of early Florentine Romanesque architecture, which he believed was a survival of Roman building practice. Clean pilasters, precise entablatures, a kind of restrained grandeur. Move forward a few decades to the High Renaissance and the fireplaces grow more elaborate. In the Palazzo Farnese in Rome, one of the grandest private residences ever built in the city, begun around 1514 under the patronage of Cardinal Alessandro Farnese. The fireplaces in the main reception rooms are enormous, architecturally imposing structures with carved caryatids, heraldic lilies and inscriptions in Latin. They are designed by Antonio da San Gallo the Younger, one of the leading architects of his age, and they are objectively speaking magnificent. They are also, by all accounts, not very good at heating the room. Because here is the fundamental tension at the heart of the Renaissance fireplace. The architects and artists designing these pieces were thinking about proportion, about visual harmony, about the impression the fireplace would make on a visitor entering the room. They were thinking like painters and sculptors. They were not thinking like heating engineers. The opening of a fireplace needs to be proportioned correctly relative to the depth of the firebox and the size of the flue for the combustion to work properly. The rate at which air moves up through the chimney, pulling the combustion gases with it, depends on precise relationships between these dimensions. Too large an opening relative to the flue, and you get a smoky room. Too shallow a firebox, and the fire burns inefficiently. Too decorated a surround, and the air currents around the opening get disrupted. Many Renaissance fireplaces were from a purely functional standpoint disasters. They smoked intermittently. They drew cold air from every crack and gap in the room, because a large chimney is essentially a powerful suction device, and it does not discriminate between the warm air inside the room and the cold air outside. Contemporary accounts from the 16th and 17th centuries' letters, household accounts, architectural treatises contain remarkably consistent complaints about rooms being simultaneously smoky and cold, the fire burning at one end and the windows rattling from the draught at the other. One English household account from the early 17th century records a Lord Steward purchasing in a single winter quantities of firewood sufficient to keep 12 fireplaces burning nearly continuously from October through March. 12 fireplaces in one house. And the steward still notes in the same account that certain upstairs chambers were deemed too cold for habitation in January and February. That detail stops me every time I read it. 12 fireplaces. Still not enough, because the wall fireplace, for all its beauty, was fighting a losing battle against the physics of large, poorly insulated stone buildings, with thin glass windows and gaps in every joint and seam. The heat it produced was radiant, it warmed what it directly faced, but it could not heat the air of a large room uniformly. People sat close to the fire they roasted on one side and froze on the other, and they developed extraordinary cultural adaptations to manage this reality. Tapestries. This is something I find completely fascinating and almost nobody talks about. The massive wall tapestries that hang in medieval and Renaissance palaces and castles are often discussed purely as art objects, as demonstrations of wealth, as narrative storytelling in textile form, as records of mythological and historical scenes. And they are all of those things, but they were also fundamentally insulation. A thick wool tapestry hung against a stone wall does several things simultaneously. It blocks the cold. Radiating from the stone, it traps a layer of air between itself and the wall, and it prevents the draughts that would otherwise flow along the cold stone surface. In a room with tapestried walls, the perceived temperature could be several degrees higher than in the same room with bare stone walls, even without any change in the fire. Wealthy households maintained entire inventories of tapestries, and the accounts of moving households, the practice of a noble family moving between their various properties throughout the year, include detailed records of tapestries being carefully rolled, packed, transported, and rehung in each location. They were not decorations you left behind when you travelled. They were equipment. They were part of the heating system. The same logic applied to bed hangings, those heavy curtains that surrounded a four-poster bed on all four sides and across the top. Inside those curtains, with 2 or 3 people sleeping, and their collective body heat trapped by the heavy fabric, you could maintain a sleeping temperature that was genuinely tolerable, even in a room where you could see your breath. The bed was in effect a portable sleeping chamber within the larger unheatable room. You went to bed not just to sleep, but to be warm enough to sleep. I find all of this deeply charming in an exhausting sort of way. The sheer amount of human ingenuity directed at the problem of staying warm in a beautiful but functionally inadequate space. But now let me shift the lens slightly, because so far I've been talking primarily about the Italian Renaissance and the English experience. And I think that is a somewhat incomplete picture, because the story of the Renaissance fireplace plays out very differently depending on which part of Europe you're looking at. In France, particularly in the great chateau of the Loire Valley, built for the French royal court during the 15th and 16th centuries, the fireplace reached perhaps its most theatrically extravagant form anywhere in Europe. The Chateau of Chambord, begun in 1519 under the reign of Francis I, contains an almost hallucinatory roofscape of chimneys, over 300 of them, all different, all elaborately decorated, rising from the roof like a stone forest visible from miles away across the flat landscape of the Sologne. 300 chimneys on one building. Now, before you ask, no, Chambord was not actually heated by 300 separate fireplaces all burning simultaneously. Many of those chimneys served fireplaces that were used only occasionally in guest apartments or ceremonial rooms occupied for specific events. The chateau was a hunting lodge, a royal retreat used for several weeks a year rather than continuously inhabited. But the visual statement was intentional, and it was overwhelming. All those chimneys said in the clearest possible architectural language, the person who lives here commands extraordinary resources. The person who lives here can afford to burn wood on an industrial scale. The person who lives here is not cold. Francis I reportedly spent an enormous portion of the French royal treasury on Chambord. The total cost in contemporary currency is genuinely difficult to calculate, but modern historians estimate it in the hundreds of millions of dollars in today's terms, and a not insignificant portion of that cost went into the design and construction of those chimneys, those purely extravagantly declarative chimneys that were in many cases more symbol than substance. Here is my personal view on this, and you can disagree if you like. I think there is something genuinely human about Chambord's chimneys that makes me love them, even while recognizing the absurdity. They are a declaration of optimism, a declaration that the world can be warm, that winter can be defeated or at least visually overwhelmed. Francis was essentially building a monument to the idea of warmth, not just the reality of it. And perhaps that is not so different from what we do today. When we put in a gas fireplace, we do not technically need or design a living room around a wood stove we will use 4 times a year. The fire means something beyond its BTS. It always has. Now, and I want to make sure we cover this because it is genuinely significant and often overlooked, the Renaissance period also produced one actual meaningful, technical improvement to fireplace design. One innovation that was not purely decorative. The fireback. A fireback is a cast iron plate, typically quite ornate and decorated with heraldic or mythological scenes, fitted at the back of the fireplace opening. The practical function is twofold. It protects the back wall of the firebox from the direct heat of the fire, which would otherwise gradually damage the stonework or brickwork. And critically, it absorbs heat during the fire and then radiates that heat back into the room, both while the fire is burning and for some time after the fire dies down. Cast iron has excellent thermal mass. It heats slowly and retains heat well. A substantial fireback in a fireplace that has been burning for several hours becomes a genuinely useful supplemental heat source, continuing to warm the room even after the fire itself has faded to embers. Firebacks began appearing in northern European homes, particularly in Germany, the Netherlands and England during the 16th century, and they became widespread through the 17th. They were also frequently objects of considerable beauty in their own right. Foundries competed to produce the most attractive designs, biblical scenes, royal portraits, coats of arms, decorative borders. A fine fireback was a display piece as much as a functional object. And here is what I find interesting about the fireback as a historical artifact. It represents the first moment in post-Roman European history where someone said clearly and practically, the wall fireplace is not efficient enough, and we need to do something about it. Not by abandoning the wall fireplace, its social and architectural role was by this point too deeply embedded to dislodge, but by adding to it, improving it incrementally, squeezing a little more thermal performance out of a fundamentally limited design. That incremental pragmatic approach to improving the fireplace, accepting it as a cultural institution, while trying to make it work better, would define the next 2 centuries of heating history, and it would produce eventually 2 of the most interesting characters in the entire story of home heating. One was an American founding father with a talent for self-promotion and an inexhaustible curiosity about airflow. The other was a counter-man born in America who became one of the most influential scientists in Europe, who served a Bavarian prince, and who redesigned the household fireplace so thoroughly that the improvements he made are still found in chimneys being built today. You may have heard of Benjamin Franklin. You have almost certainly never heard of Count Rumford. And I promise you, Rumford's story is one of the stranger, more interesting, more quietly consequential stories in the history of everyday life. That is exactly where we are going next. Let me tell you about 2 men who were obsessed with the same problem and solved it in completely different ways. One of them is one of the most famous Americans who ever lived, a founding father, a diplomat, a philosopher, a man whose face is on the $100 bill. You already know his name. The other one, and this is the part that genuinely surprises people, was born in the same century in the same country, spoke the same language and produced innovations in fireplace design that were arguably more practical, more lasting and more widely adopted than anything the famous one ever built. And yet most people, if you asked them on the street today, would stare at you blankly if you said his name. That name is Benjamin Thompson, and the title he eventually earned, Count Rumford, is the name that heating engineers and chimney specialists still use today when they talk about the design principles that make a fireplace actually work. But to understand why both of these men matter, we need to understand the world they were trying to fix. By the middle of the 18th century, the wall fireplace had been the dominant heating technology in northern and western Europe for roughly 600 years. 600 years! And in those 600 years, the fundamental design had barely changed. The firebox was still essentially a rectangular cavity in a wall. The chimney flue was still a vertical shaft. The proportions varied wider, narrower, deeper, shallower, but the basic physics remained the same. And the basic problems remained the same too. Cold rooms, smoky rooms, enormous fuel consumption, drafts, the paradox of a roaring fire that somehow left you shivering. What made the 18th century different was not that these problems suddenly became worse. They had always been bad. What changed was that people started approaching them scientifically, with measurement, with experimentation, with a new kind of intellectual seriousness about the natural world that we associate with the period historians call the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment had a particular genius for taking things that everybody had always accepted as simply the way things were. The behavior of heat, the movement of air, the physics of combustion, and asking, but why? And then, but what if we changed this? Benjamin Franklin was in many ways the embodiment of that spirit. He was curious about everything, irritated by inefficiency, and constitutionally incapable of leaving a problem unsolved if he thought he could do something about it. His encounter with the fireplace problem came from direct personal frustration. Franklin lived through the Pennsylvania winters, and the colonial American home of the early 18th century, built on English traditions heated by English-style wall fireplaces, was by his own account deeply inadequate. The fireplaces consumed staggering quantities of wood that had to be chopped, split-seasoned, stacked, and carried. Colonial Americans living near the edge of settled land had access to seemingly unlimited forest, but the labor of fuel preparation was enormous. And still, despite all that effort and all that wood, the rooms were frequently cold because so much of the heat went straight up the chimney. Franklin thought about this problem the way he thought about all problems systematically from first principles. What he asked was actually happening inside a conventional fireplace. Where was the heat going? Why did so much of it escape his analysis, which he published in 1744 in a pamphlet called An Account of the New Invented Pennsylvania Fireplace? Was genuinely insightful. He understood, and this was not obvious at the time, that the primary mechanism by which a conventional fireplace heated a room was radiant heat. The fire radiated energy directly outward in the direction it faced. The hot gases produced by combustion, by contrast, rose immediately up the chimney and were lost. They did not contribute meaningfully to heating the room, so his solution was, in essence, what if we could keep the hot gases in the room longer? What if we could make those gases give up more of their heat to the surrounding air before they escaped up the flue? The Franklin stove, which was not quite a stove in the modern sense, but a cast-iron firebox that could be inserted into an existing fireplace opening or installed. Freestanding, was designed around this idea. It used a system of internal baffles and chambers that forced the hot combustion gases to travel a longer, more convoluted path before they reached the flue. Longer path meant more time in contact with the cast-iron surfaces of the stove. More time in contact meant more heat transferred into the metal. More heat in the metal meant more radiant and convective heat into the room. The design also incorporated a feature Franklin was particularly proud of. Fresh air drawn from outside was preheated as it entered the stove before mixing with the combustion air. The idea was to reduce the amount of cold outdoor air being sucked into the room to feed the fire, one of the major causes of drafts and cold floors in conventionally fireplace-heated rooms. In theory, this was elegant. Franklin claimed his stove used roughly 1/4 of the wood of a conventional fireplace to produce the same amount of warmth. He offered the design freely to the public, refusing to patent it in a characteristically Franklinian gesture of enlightened generosity, and it spread widely through the American colonies and was taken up with interest in Europe. But here is the honest part of the story, the part that Franklin's admirers sometimes gloss over. The Franklin stove in its original form had a significant flaw. The preheated air system, that clever feature Franklin was so proud of, did not work very well in practice. The cold air intake and the preheating chamber functioned adequately under certain conditions, but under others, particularly in cold weather. When the temperature differential between inside and outside was greatest, it produced exactly the problem it was designed to prevent. The stove could actually cause downdrafts, cold air flowing backward down the flue and into the room in certain wind and temperature conditions. The design was modified several times by other inventors in the years following, and the versions that became widely successful were in many respects quite different from Franklin's original. The name stuck. The principle that an enclosed cast-iron firebox was more efficient than an open-wall fireplace was sound and important, but the specific execution required considerable refinement. Franklin himself, to his credit, acknowledged in his private correspondence that the stove had limitations. He was not one to suppress evidence that contradicted his theories. He was above all a scientist, and a scientist follows the data. Now let us talk about Count Rumford, because this is where the story, in my view, gets truly fascinating. Benjamin Thompson was born in 1753 in Woburn, Massachusetts, a small town not far from Boston, the son of a farmer. His early life was marked by extraordinary intellectual precocity, a talent for self-promotion, and a moral flexibility that his various employers and associates would come to know well over the years. He was by any objective assessment a complicated man. During the American Revolution, Thompson remained loyal to the British Crown, serving as a spy for the British forces, and eventually fleeing to England when the political situation made his position in Massachusetts untenable. He later moved to Bavaria, where he served as a Minister of War and Interior under the Elector Karl Theodor, reorganizing the Bavarian military and implementing sweeping social reforms. It was the Bavarian Elector who granted him the title by which he is best remembered, Count Rumford, the name derived from Rumford, New Hampshire, the town that would later be renamed Concord. His personal life was, depending on your perspective, either admirably unconventional or comprehensively chaotic. He had affairs. He made enemies with impressive efficiency. He married the widow of the chemist Antoine Lavoisier, and by most accounts made her profoundly miserable. Their separation, when it came, was apparently a relief to both parties. But none of that biography, interesting as it is why Rumford matters to our story. Rumford matters because somewhere in the midst of all his other activities, he became obsessed with the fireplace. Not with making it more beautiful, not with making it more impressive as a status symbol, with making it actually work. His approach was methodical and empirical in a way that set him apart from almost everyone who had studied fireplaces before him. He went into houses, actual working households in London and Bavaria, and observed how fireplaces were functioning. He measured. He noted where the smoke went, how the air moved, what happened when he made small adjustments to the geometry of the firebox. He was doing what we would now call field research, and he was doing it with a level of patience and precision that was remarkable for the era. What he discovered was, in hindsight, almost agonizingly simple, and yet it had eluded fireplace builders for 600 years. The problem with the conventional 18th century fireplace was primarily one of geometry. The typical fireplace of the period had a firebox that was approximately as deep as it was wide. The throat, the narrow opening at the top of the firebox where it transitioned into the chimney flue, was positioned centrally above the fire, and the back wall of the firebox was vertical or nearly so. Rumford's analysis showed that this geometry was nearly ideal for producing smoke in the room, and nearly terrible for projecting heat into it. Here is the physics stated as simply as I can manage. When a fire burns in a deep firebox with a vertical back wall, the hot gases produced by combustion rise straight up from the fire toward the throat. But the cold air coming in from the room necessary to feed the combustion rushes in from the front. Where these two air masses meet directly above the burning fire, you get turbulence. The cold room air and the hot combustion gases mix chaotically, cooling the gases before they reach the flue, and sometimes pushing them forward into the room rather than up and out. Smoke in the room, every time. Rumford's solution was a set of modifications to the firebox geometry that addressed each of these problems directly. First, he made the firebox shallower, significantly shallower than convention dictated. A Rumford fireplace is typically only about 1/3 as deep as it is wide. This brings the fire physically closer to the front of the fireplace opening, which means more of the radiant heat from the fire is directed outward into the room, rather than absorbed by the deep back walls of the firebox. Second, he angled the side walls of the firebox, what are called the covings, outward at an angle, so that instead of running parallel to each other front to back, they splayed apart toward the room opening. This splaying had two effects. It widened the view of the fire from the room, allowing more radiant heat to reach more of the space, and it directed the airflow inside the firebox in a way that separated the incoming cold air from the outgoing hot gases. Third, and most critically, he redesigned the throat of the fireplace. The throat, that narrow slot between the firebox and the flue, he made much smaller than conventional practice, and he gave it a specific curved shape that encouraged the hot combustion gases to flow smoothly and rapidly upward into the flue without turbulence. Faster, smoother flow up the flue meant better draw, which meant the fire burned more completely, which meant more heat and less smoke. The combination of these three changes was transformative. Rumford described his experiments and findings in a series of essays published in the 1790s, collected under the title Essays Political, Economical and Philosophical. They are not light reading. Rumford was thorough to the point of sometimes being exhausting, but the clarity of his reasoning is remarkable. He was effectively inventing the science of fireplace design from scratch, and he knew it. He also had an irrepressible talent for self-promotion that made Franklin look modest by comparison. Rumford claimed that his fireplace design reduced fuel consumption by between 50 and 75% compared to conventional fireplaces. He claimed to have personally converted over 500 London fireplaces to his design, going house to house, supervising the modifications himself. He wrote extensively about visiting the homes of the poor and the wealthy alike, measuring temperatures, observing drafts, calculating fuel savings. Whether all of these specific claims were perfectly accurate is something historians argue about. But the core claim that his redesigned firebox geometry produced dramatically better results than conventional practice was verified by enough independent builders and homeowners that it spread quickly. By the early 19th century, the Rumford fireplace design, or variants of it, had become the recommended standard in British architectural practice. Thomas Jefferson installed Rumford fireplaces at Monticello, his Virginia estate, after reading Rumford's essays. The poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge mentioned Rumford fireplaces approvingly in his correspondence. And here is the remarkable thing about the Rumford legacy that I find genuinely moving in a quietly historical way. The proportions Rumford specified, the shallow firebox, the splayed covings, the small curved throat, are still used today. If you go to a specialist fireplace builder and ask them to construct a properly functioning masonry fireplace from scratch, they'll build you something that is in its essential geometry a Rumford fireplace. The specific numbers have been refined slightly over 2 centuries of practice and experimentation, but the principles are his. A man who died in 1814, more than 200 years ago, working with nothing but observation and reason, and a willingness to crawl into cold London fireplaces to measure their dimensions, figured out something correct enough that it has never been fundamentally superseded. That is the kind of intellectual achievement that deserves far more celebration than it gets. I want to pause here and ask you something that I genuinely find myself wondering about. Franklin and Rumford were both working on the same problem at roughly the same time, the problem of the inefficient, smoky, cold European fireplace. Franklin went for a structural reimagining, replace the open fireplace with an enclosed stove, change the fuel-gas relationship entirely. Rumford went for a geometric refinement, keep the open fireplace but redesign it precisely enough that it works correctly. In the long run, both approaches survived and flourished. Enclosed stoves, descendants of Franklin's idea, became dominant in Germany, Scandinavia, and Central Europe. Refined open fireplaces, descendants of Rumford's approach, remained the preferred form in Britain and eventually in the United States. 2 solutions to one problem. 2 different cultures choosing different answers. And I think that tells you something interesting about the relationship between technology and identity. The Germans and Scandinavians chose efficiency. The British chose the visible flame. The enclosed stove is unquestionably more efficient. It converts more fuel to room heat. It is safer. It is easier to regulate. It produces less particulate matter. From a pure engineering standpoint, it is the superior device, but you cannot sit in front of it and watch the fire. And that, as I have come to believe after spending a long time thinking about this history, is not a trivial consideration. Watching fire is something human beings are apparently very reluctant to give up, regardless of the practical case for doing so. We will come back to that idea near the end of this story because I think it leads somewhere genuinely surprising. But right now we need to leave the 18th century and move into the 19th. Because the world was about to change in ways that made everything we have discussed so far look like prologue. The Industrial Revolution was coming, and with it came coal, and with coal came something that transformed European cities into a vision that later generations would find almost impossible to believe, and that the people living through it largely accepted as the inevitable price of progress. A sky the colour of a bruise, air that tasted of sulphur, buildings that turned black within months of being built. And inside the homes of the wealthy fireplaces more elaborate and more ornate than anything that had come before, burning the dirtiest fuel in human history, with a kind of proud defiance that is in retrospect genuinely staggering. The Victorian era is next, and if you think the Renaissance fireplace was a study in contradictions, beautiful objects producing inadequate heat, wait until you see what the Victorians managed to do with coal. Coal changed everything, not slowly, not gradually, not in the gentle incremental way that most technological transitions unfold across generations. Coal arrived in the domestic life of Victorian Britain with the force of something inevitable, something that had been building underground for millions of years and was finally definitively unleashed. And if you want to understand what it felt like to live through that transition, to be an ordinary person in London or Manchester or Birmingham in the middle of the 19th century, heating your home with coal for the first time, you need to first understand just how dramatically the world around you had already changed. By 1850, London was the largest city on Earth. Its population had more than doubled in the preceding 50 years, swelling from roughly 1 million people at the turn of the century to well over 2 million by mid-century and climbing fast. People were pouring in from the countryside, from Ireland, from every corner of the British Isles, drawn by the factories and the workshops and the docks, and the promise sometimes fulfilled, often not of work and wages. And all of those people needed to be housed, and all of those houses needed to be heated. Wood, which had been the primary domestic fuel in Britain for centuries, was running desperately short in the urban areas. The forests that had once surrounded English cities had been largely consumed by centuries of demand for heating, for cooking, for shipbuilding, for charcoal production. By the 17th century, the wood shortage in and around London was already serious enough that wealthier households were increasingly turning to sea coal transported by ship from the coalfields of northeastern England, primarily from the area around Newcastle, as a supplement and eventually a replacement for wood. But it was the Industrial Revolution that transformed coal from an increasingly common fuel into the absolute foundation of British domestic life. The railways made coal cheap enough and abundant enough to reach every corner of the country. A ton of coal that might have cost a working-class family in Manchester a prohibitive sum in 1780 was by 1850 affordable enough to heat a modest terrace house through a full winter. And so, coal became the fuel of Victorian Britain, in homes of every class, in every city, burned in millions of fireplaces every day from September through April. The consequences for the atmosphere of British cities were, to put it mildly, significant. Let me paint you a picture of London on a winter morning in, say, 1860. You wake up in your bedroom a modestly prosperous household middle class, by the standards of the day, a terrace house in one of the expanding suburbs south of the river. The bedroom is cold. You can see your breath. The coal fire in the bedroom grate went out sometime in the night, and the room has dropped to perhaps 8 or 10 degrees Celsius, which is cold enough to make getting out of bed a genuine act of will. You pull on your clothes quickly. You go downstairs where the kitchen range a large cast iron cooking and heating appliance that burns coal continuously throughout the day, has kept the kitchen at a tolerable temperature overnight. The servant, if you have one, or the wife if you do not, has already raked the coals and added fresh fuel. There is warmth here and the smell of coal smoke, which at this point in your life is simply the smell of morning. You have never known anything else. You look out the window, the street outside is barely visible. A thick yellowish fog has settled over the city, what Londoners call a particular, or what we now call a pea super. This fog is not weather, or rather it's not only weather. It is the accumulated output of hundreds of thousands of coal fires burning in hundreds of thousands of homes and factories across the city, mixing with the natural fog that rolls in from the Thames on cold still mornings. The sulfur dioxide from burning coal combines with water vapour to form a dilute sulphurous acid mist. The particulate matter, the soot and unburned carbon particles, thickens the fog to a consistency that contemporaries compared to yellow-brown soup, or on particularly bad days to a darkness that turned noon into twilight. This was not occasional. This was not unusual. This was London in winter. This was normal. The painter Claude Monet visited London in the winter of 1899 and returned several times over the following years, captivated by what he called the extraordinary effects of the fog on the Thames. He painted the Houses of Parliament dissolving into mist, Waterloo Bridge barely visible through layers of haze, the river itself glowing with a strange amber light filtered through pollution and fog. His London paintings are luminously beautiful, some of the finest work of his career. They are also, if you think about what he was actually painting, a portrait of an environmental catastrophe in slow motion. Monet saw beauty in the fog because he was an artist passing through, not a child growing up in it. The residents of Victorian London did not for the most part have the luxury of aesthetic distance. Medical records from the period document chronic bronchitis at rates that modern epidemiologists find staggering. Studies of mortality data from London in the second half of the 19th century show consistent spikes in deaths from respiratory illness during the winter months, spikes that track almost perfectly with periods of dense fog. Doctors of the era noted the correlation between foggy weather and increased respiratory admissions without fully understanding the mechanism, because the science of air pollution and its effects on human health was still in its infancy. One figure that I find particularly striking by some estimates, London coal fires were collectively burning something in the range of 3.5 million tonnes of coal per year by the 1880s. 3.5 million tonnes in a single city every year. The smoke from that combustion had nowhere to go except up, and then when the weather was still and cold, strode back down. And here is the historical irony that I keep turning over in my mind. The people of medieval Europe, as we discussed earlier, suffered from the smoke of their open central hearths, and had no idea their health was being affected. The Victorians were burning coal in quantities that dwarfed anything the medieval period had produced in cities dense enough to concentrate the pollution to dangerous levels, and they knew it was causing harm. There was ample medical and scientific discussion of the coal smoke problem throughout the Victorian period. Reformers wrote about it, doctors testified before parliamentary committees about it, and yet it continued for decades. Because the alternative cold homes was unthinkable, and because coal was cheap and the economy depended on it and the political will to address it was simply not there. Does that remind you of anything? I will leave that thought with you. But now let me tell you about the other side of the Victorian coal story. Because while the air outside was turning poisonous, something fascinating was happening inside the homes of the Victorian middle and upper classes. Something that transforms the fireplace from a heating appliance into what I can only describe as a full-blown cultural obsession. The Victorian parlour fireplace is one of the most extraordinary objects in the history of domestic design, and I mean extraordinary in the fullest sense, extraordinary in its beauty, extraordinary in its ambition, and extraordinary in the sheer quantity of human labour and material wealth poured into what was at its functional core a hole in a wall. the cast iron fireplace insert a prefabricated firebox and surround made in a foundry installed as a single unit into an existing chimney opening had been available in Britain since the late 18th century, but it was the Victorian period, with its combination of industrial mass production, expanding middle-class prosperity, and insatiable appetite for domestic ornamentation, that turned the cast iron fireplace into an art form. Victorian fireplace inserts were produced in an astonishing variety of styles. Gothic revival with pointed arches and tracery, classical with columns and pediments, aesthetic movement with stylized sunflowers and peacock feathers, inspired by Japanese design, arts and crafts with hand-hammered metalwork and tiles painted with medieval scenes. The major foundries companies like Coalbrookdale in Shropshire, which have been producing cast-iron objects since the early 18th century, employed designers whose sole job was to create new fireplace patterns that would appeal to an increasingly design-conscious consuming public. And then there were the tiles. Oh, the tiles. If you visit a Victorian house that has retained its original fireplaces, and there are still many in Britain, particularly in the terrace houses of cities like Liverpool, Bristol, and parts of London, you will often find flanking the cast-iron firebox a pair of panels made up of painted ceramic tiles. These tiles are among the most charming objects of the Victorian decorative arts. They were typically produced by Staffordshire potteries and decorated with transfer-printed or hand-painted designs, pastoral scenes, botanical illustrations, classical figures, narrative sequences from literature or mythology, geometric patterns, or the flowing, organic forms of the arts and crafts movement. Minton, one of the great Victorian ceramics manufacturers, produced fireplace tiles that are now collected as significant works of art. Their catalogue from the 1870s runs to hundreds of designs. You could choose tiles depicting the months of the year or the four seasons or scenes from Shakespeare, or illustrations from Aesop's fables or portraits of famous poets. The fireplace was not just a heat source. It was a gallery wall. It was a statement of education and taste and cultural aspiration. This matters beyond mere aesthetics, and I want to make this point clearly because I think it is often underappreciated in discussions of Victorian domestic culture. The Victorian obsession with fireplace decoration was not superficial vanity. It was the expression of a deeply held belief about what a home was for and what it communicated to the world. The Victorians, particularly the expanding Victorian middle class, the families of merchants and professionals, and skilled tradespeople who were building their prosperity one generation at a time, were intensely conscious of the home as a moral environment. The domestic sphere was idealized in Victorian culture as a refuge from the harsh, competitive, morally compromising world of commerce and industry. The home was supposed to be beautiful, orderly, refined, a physical expression of the family's values and aspirations, and the fireplace was the heart of that environment, literally and symbolically. Charles Dickens, who understood Victorian domestic life better than almost any other observer of his era, returned to the image of the hearth again and again in his novels. In A Christmas Carol, the Cratchit family's celebration is inseparable from their modest fire. In Bleak House, the warmth or coldness of a fireplace in any given scene functions almost as a moral indicator of the character's emotional states. Dickens knew that his readers felt the fire felt its presence or absence in a way that required no explanation. The fireplace was a shared emotional language. The Christmas fireplace in particular became a cultural icon during the Victorian period in a way it had never quite been before. The specific visual image of a blazing hearth on Christmas morning stockings hung from the mantel. The family gathered in warmth and light was crystallized during the Victorian era and has remained essentially unchanged in popular imagination ever since. When you picture a traditional Christmas fireplace today, you're almost certainly picturing something invented in the 1840s and 1850s. It is a Victorian image, not a medieval one, not an Elizabethan one. The Victorians created it deliberately as part of a broader reinvention of Christmas as a domestic family-centred celebration. Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, who brought many German Christmas traditions to the British court, gets much of the credit for the Victorian Christmas revival. But the fireplace was central to the iconography in ways that go beyond any single person's influence. It was the natural focal point. Where else would a Victorian family gather on the coldest morning of the year? Now I want to ask you something, because this is a tension I find genuinely interesting. We've just spent some time with two realities of the Victorian fireplace that seem almost impossible to hold in the same frame. On one hand, pollution on a catastrophic scale, respiratory illness, affecting millions, a city periodically plunged into toxic darkness. On the other hand, objects of genuine beauty, a rich decorative culture, a heartfelt domestic iconography that still resonates today. How do you hold both of those things at once? How do you think about an era that produced such beauty in the service of something so environmentally harmful? I think the honest answer is that you hold them both without resolving the tension, because the tension is the truth. The Victorian fireplace was beautiful and it was harmful, and the people who loved it were not stupid or evil. They were people living within the technological and economic constraints of their time, making the best choices they could see, just as every generation does. The difference, and this is important, is that the Victorians had enough scientific knowledge to understand that coal smoke was causing harm. The medieval peasant breathing the smoke of a central hearth had no framework for understanding respiratory disease as an environmental cause. The Victorian city dweller did have that framework, at least partially, and the choice was still made collectively and politically to continue. That is a more uncomfortable truth than simple historical ignorance, and I think it is worth sitting with. But history, as always, does not stay still. The Victorian coal fire's dominance over British domestic life was not permanent. It could not be. The cities were changing. The economy was changing. And in the early 20th century, a series of events, some gradual, some sudden, some catastrophic, would begin to dismantle the coal fireplace's hold on European homes. And somewhere in that dismantling something unexpected would happen, something that speaks directly to a question we have been circling around since the very first part of this story. Because it turns out that when you take the fireplace away from people, when you replace it with something cleaner, more efficient, more practical, they do not simply move on, they grieve. They miss it. They spend considerable amounts of money trying to get it back. And that grief, that strange persistent longing for a fire that you do not technically need, is the most revealing thing about the human relationship with flame that this entire history has produced. But before we get to the 20th century and what it did to heating, we need to spend some time with the story that happened in the shadow of all those beautiful Victorian chimneys. A story about the people who kept those chimneys clean, about small hands in narrow spaces and a darkness that most of Victorian Britain preferred not to look at directly. It is not a comfortable story, but it is part of this one, and it deserves to be told. There is a particular kind of historical discomfort that comes not from distance but from proximity. Not the discomfort of reading about ancient civilizations doing things we cannot fully comprehend, but the discomfort of reading about people who lived recently enough that their great-grandchildren are still alive, people who wore clothing we would recognize, who read newspapers, who attended church, who considered themselves civilized and decent and Christian, doing something that when you look at it directly and honestly is very difficult to defend. The story of the climbing boys is that kind of discomfort, and I want to tell it carefully, not to shock, not to be dramatic, but because it is genuinely part of the history of the fireplace, inseparable from it, And because the way Victorian Britain responded to it slowly and inadequately, and with enormous resistance, tells you something important about how societies justify the unjustifiable when the alternative is inconvenient. Let us start with a simple physical fact. A chimney flue in a typical Victorian terrace house was a square or rectangular shaft built into the thickness of the wall, running from the fireplace opening at the bottom to the chimney pot at the top. The interior dimension of these flues varied, but in older buildings constructed before any regulatory standards existed, they were often as narrow as 9 inches by 9 inches. 9 inches. That is roughly 23 centimetres, slightly less than the width of a standard piece of paper. A 9-inch square flue cannot be cleaned by an adult. An adult cannot fit inside it, but a small child can. And for roughly 2 centuries of British history from the late 17th century through most of the 19th, the standard method for cleaning the accumulated soot from these flues was to send a child up inside them. The child would climb using their back and elbows and knees pressed against the walls of the flue for friction, scraping the soot from the walls as they ascended, pushing accumulated debris down to the fireplace below, where it could be collected and removed. The children used for this work were called climbing boys. Occasionally climbing girls, though boys were more common. They were typically between 4 and 10 years old when their working lives began, young enough to fit, old enough to be somewhat useful, old enough to understand instructions. The youngest recorded cases involved children as young as 3.5 years old. They were not in the vast majority of cases the children of the master sweeps who employed them. They were orphans or children sold by desperately poor parents, or children taken from workhouses by sweeps who paid a nominal fee for their labour under a legal arrangement called apprenticeship, a word that in this context meant something closer to indentured servitude with no fixed end date and no guaranteed terms. The master sweep would typically have several climbing boys at a time. He would wake them before dawn because the flues had to be cleaned before the household fires were lit for the day. The boys would be taken to the house, instructed which chimney to clean and sent up. The master sweep would wait at the bottom. Now, if you are anything like me, you are probably asking yourself, how exactly do you climb inside a 9-inch flue? What does that actually involve physically? Contemporary accounts combined with medical records and the testimony of former climbing boys collected by parliamentary investigators in the early 19th century give us a fairly detailed and genuinely harrowing picture. The boys climbed by pressing their back against one side of the flue and their feet and knees against the other and pushing themselves upward in a series of small, effortful movements. Their elbows, which were pressed against the rough brick walls to provide grip and stability, took enormous punishment. New climbing boys would have the skin of their elbows and knees rubbed raw within weeks, developing painful open sores that the master sweeps treated by hardening a process that involved rubbing the raw skin with strong brine, or in some accounts with salt alone to force it to callous more quickly. The boys were told this was for their own benefit. It was in a narrow technical sense true. Hardened skin bled less and healed faster. It also hurt enormously. The soot itself was a constant physical assault. The boys worked without any protective clothing other than their regular rags. They breathed the soot they loosened as they climbed. Their eyes were constantly irritated, their nostrils and airways filled with carbon dust. Many developed a condition known to physicians of the period as sooty warts, a form of scrotal cancer caused by chronic exposure to the carcinogenic compounds in coal tar soot. Percival Pott, a London surgeon, described this condition in a landmark medical paper published in 1775, noting that it appeared almost exclusively in men who'd been employed as climbing boys in childhood. It was in fact one of the first documented cases of an occupationally caused cancer in medical history. One more detail that I cannot leave out because it captures something essential about the physical reality of this work. The flues were not always vertical. In houses with multiple stories and complex rooflines, flues sometimes changed direction, a horizontal or diagonal section connecting to a vertical one. These bends were called elbows, and they were the most dangerous parts of any climb. A boy could become stuck in an elbow, stuck with his arms pinned above him or below him, unable to move forward or back in a space so narrow that he could not turn his head. When a boy got stuck, the master sweep's solution was often to light a small fire below. The heat and smoke rising from the fire below was intended to motivate the boy to push harder to find the strength to free himself from the elbow and continue climbing. The same accounts that describe this practice also document with the measured clinical tone of parliamentary investigators, doing their best to remain professional, the cases where the fire did not motivate the boy quickly enough. I am going to let that land for a moment because I think it deserves the weight of silence. The legislative history of the climbing boys is in its own way as disturbing as the practice itself. The first significant public advocacy on behalf of climbing boys came from a man named Jonas Hanway, a merchant and philanthropist who is better remembered today for popularizing the umbrella in Britain than for his campaign on behalf of chimney sweeps. In 1785, Hanway published a pamphlet describing the conditions under which climbing boys lived and worked, and lobbied Parliament for protective legislation. He was ignored. In 1834, a full 49 years after Hanway's pamphlet, Parliament passed the Chimney Sweepers Act, which prohibited the apprenticeship of children under the age of 10 to master sweeps, and required that apprentices be at least 14 before they were sent up chimneys. The act was widely ignored. The enforcement mechanisms were minimal. Master sweeps continued to employ young children essentially as before, because the law had no teeth, and the people responsible for enforcement, local magistrates and parish officials, had little interest in disrupting a trade that kept their chimneys clean. Further legislation followed in 1840 and 1850 each time, tightening the restrictions slightly, each time being largely unenforced. The man who finally succeeded in passing meaningful enforceable legislation was Lord Shaftesbury, the great Victorian reformer who spent his career fighting for children in factories, mines and chimneys with a persistence and moral clarity that stands as one of the genuine honours of the 19th century. The Chimney Sweepers Act of 1875, 40 years after the first inadequate attempt at regulation, almost a full century after Hanway's original pamphlet, finally made it a criminal offence for master sweeps to employ climbing boys and required sweeps to be licensed by the police. By 1875, it is worth noting mechanical chimney sweeping brushes had been available for over a century. The inventor George Smart had patented a flexible rod brush system in 1828, and similar designs had existed since the late 18th century. These brushes could clean most standard flues effectively without requiring a child to climb inside. Many master sweeps had access to them. They chose not to use them because children were cheaper and for the most awkward flues more adaptable. Let me repeat that. Climbing boys were still being sent up chimneys decades after a perfectly adequate mechanical alternative existed because children were cheaper. I find that fact more arresting than almost anything else in this story, because it strips away any defence of ignorance or technical necessity. The persistence of the climbing boy trade in Victorian Britain was not a failure of technology. It was a failure of moral imagination and political will. Charles Kingsley, the Victorian clergyman, novelist and social reformer, published a children's novel in 1863 called The Water Babies, whose protagonist is a 10-year-old climbing boy named Tom, who works for a brutal master sweep named Grimes. The novel is part fairy tale, part social commentary, and it was explicitly intended by Kingsley as a contribution to the campaign for reform. He wanted middle-class Victorian readers, the parents who would read this book aloud to their children, beside those beautiful tiled fireplaces we discussed last time, to feel the reality of the climbing boys' lives through the medium of fiction. It worked in the limited way that literature works on social change. The book was enormously popular. It is still in print today, and it contributed to the cultural shift in middle-class opinion that eventually made Lord Shaftesbury's 1875 legislation politically possible. But here is what strikes me most about the water babies as a historical artifact. Kingsley sets the opening scenes of his novel in a wealthy household. Tom the climbing boy descends from a chimney flue into a bedroom, a beautiful, clean, light-filled bedroom belonging to a little girl named Ellie. He's never seen anything like it. The white sheets, the clean walls, the pale morning light. He has never been inside a comfortable room. He's only ever seen the insides of chimneys. Kingsley knew exactly what he was doing with that image. He was asking his readers, the people sitting in rooms exactly like Ellie's bedroom, warming themselves by those ornate cast-iron fireplaces, to see the connection between their comfort and Tom's suffering, to understand that the warm, beautiful tile-decorated fireplace and the small child in the flue above it were part of the same system. Most of them preferred not to make that connection too directly, which is, I suppose, very human. We're all quite skilled at not seeing the costs of our comforts. There is one more dimension of this story that I want to bring in because I think it reframes the whole thing in a way that matters. The children who worked as climbing boys were not, for the most part, London children, or children of prosperous families fallen on hard times. They came disproportionately from the most marginalised communities in British society, orphans from parish workhouses, children of the Irish immigrant poor, children from the rural poor who had migrated to cities, children who had, in the language of the time, no one to speak for them, and the households that employed master sweeps, the households whose fireplaces the climbing boys cleaned, were the households of the middle and upper classes, the very households that define themselves culturally and morally around the hearth as a symbol of family warmth and domestic virtue. There is a painful irony in that. The Victorian hearth, that great symbol of domestic comfort, of family love, of Christmas warmth, of all the sentimental imagery that Dickens and Kingsley and a dozen other Victorian writers built their literary careers around, was maintained literally by the labour of children who had no families, no warmth, and no Christmas. I am not saying this to condemn the Victorians wholesale. History is more complicated than blanket condemnation, and the Victorian era also produced in Lord Shaftesbury and Jonas Hanway and Charles Kingsley and dozens of less famous reformers, people of genuine moral courage who fought hard and consistently for those children. The reform happened, eventually. But I do think it is worth holding the full picture, worth not letting the beauty of Victorian fireplace tiles and the coziness of A Christmas Carol stand entirely uncomplicated by what was happening in the flues above those beautiful fireplaces. Every warm room has a cost. The nature of that cost changes across history, but the cost is always there somewhere. The climbing boy's story ends legislatively in 1875. But the Victorian coal fireplaces story continues for several more decades, right up to the moment when a series of catastrophic events in the 20th century forced a reckoning that no amount of parliamentary debate had ever quite managed. And when that reckoning came, it came fast. Faster than anyone expected. Central heating arrived in European homes after the Second World War, not gradually but almost like a tide sweeping through in a single generation, replacing fireplaces across millions of homes, fundamentally transforming not just how people stayed warm, but how they organized their daily lives and their relationships with each other. And then here is the part I find most genuinely surprising about this entire history. People started missing the fire. Not metaphorically, not poetically, practically, materially, commercially missing it. Spending money to get it back, installing decorative fireplaces they did not need, buying candles by the hundreds of millions to simulate the flickering light of a flame, watching, and I am completely serious, YouTube videos of crackling fires for hours at a time. Why, after centuries of struggling to get warm, of choking on smoke, of children lost in flues of cities turned dark by coal, why did the fire refuse to leave? The answer to that question is, I think, the most interesting thing this entire history has to offer, and it is where we are headed next. Something about that question, why the fire refused to leave, pulls me toward a comparison I have been wanting to make for a while now. Because the story of European heating in the centuries between the medieval chimney and the Industrial Revolution is not one story. It is two stories running side by side, barely aware of each other, producing two completely different answers to the same cold winter problem. And the divide between them tells you more about the cultural character of different European peoples than almost any political or religious history I can think of. On one side, Northern and Central Europe, Germany, Scandinavia, Poland, Russia, Austria, Switzerland. The lands of long, brutal winters, dense forests, and a deeply practical relationship with survival. On the other side, France, England, and much of Western Europe. The lands of court culture, architectural grandeur, and as we established in the last chapter, fireplaces that looked extraordinary, and heated rooms with the efficiency of a moderately enthusiastic candle. The device that separated these two worlds was called the Kachelofen, and if you have never heard of it, I want to spend some time with it because it is one of the most quietly brilliant objects in the history of domestic life. The word Kachelofen is German. It translates roughly as tiled stove, and the description, while accurate, does not begin to capture what these objects actually were or what they meant to the people who built and used them. The Kachelofen is an enclosed stove, typically a tall, freestanding structure, sometimes reaching from floor to ceiling, constructed from a framework of hollow ceramic tiles fitted together around an internal firebox. The tiles themselves are the defining feature. They are not simply decorative cladding, though they are often extraordinarily beautiful. They are the engineering heart of the entire system. Here is why. Ceramic has excellent thermal mass. It absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. When you light a fire in a Kachelofen and burn it hot for 2 or 3 hours, the ceramic tiles surrounding the firebox absorb an enormous quantity of heat. When the fire dies down and eventually goes out, the tiles continue radiating that stored heat into the room, gently, evenly, consistently for many hours afterward. A well-built Kachelofen fired in the morning could keep a room at a comfortable temperature until the following morning. Some designs, particularly the larger monumental ones found in Austrian and Bavarian manor houses, could retain usable heat for up to 24 hours from a single firing. Compare that to a conventional Western European wall fireplace, which stopped producing meaningful heat approximately 15 minutes after the fire went out. The thermal efficiency difference was not marginal, it was transformational. Contemporary estimates based on studies of reconstructed historic stoves suggest that a well-designed Kachelofen converted somewhere between 70 and 80% of its fuel into useful room heat. The conventional open fireplaces we discussed earlier manage somewhere between 10 and 20% on a good day. The same quantity of wood, 4 to 8 times the warmth, from a device that had been in continuous development across Central and Northern Europe since at least the 13th century. Let me give you a sense of how early and how widely the Kachelofen took hold. Archaeological evidence of tiled stove construction has been found in German-speaking regions dating back to the 12th and 13th centuries. By the 14th century, tiled stoves were standard heating equipment in the prosperous urban homes of cities like Nuremberg, Augsburg, Zurich, and Vienna. By the 15th century, they had spread across the entirety of the Holy Roman Empire into Poland, Bohemia, Hungary, and the Baltic states, and north into Scandinavia, where they fused with local building traditions to produce regional variants that are still in daily use today. The tiles themselves became an entire art form. Medieval and Renaissance Cachalofen tiles have been found in archaeological excavations across Central Europe, and they are remarkable objects, thick, hollow, and often elaborately decorated with relief-moulded scenes, religious imagery, heraldic animals, hunting scenes, portraits of rulers, allegorical figures representing the seasons or the virtues. The best medieval tile stove workshops produced tiles whose artistic quality rivals the finest decorative ceramics of the period. There is a collection of 15th century Cachalofen tiles in the Germanisches National Museum in Nuremberg that I find genuinely moving as historical objects. Each tile is a small window into the visual world and the domestic aspirations of people who lived 600 years ago. They wanted warmth, they also wanted beauty, and they achieved both in the same object, which, as we have seen, is something the French and English architects of the period were notably struggling to do. Now, and I want to be fair here because the cultural comparison is interesting precisely when it is accurate. The Germans and Scandinavians did not adopt the Cachalofen purely out of superior wisdom or engineering virtue. Geography and climate played a significant role. The winters in Bavaria, in Poland, in Norway and the Baltic states are genuinely more severe than in most of England and France. The temperature differential between inside and outside a building in a Norwegian January is greater than anything a typical English household regularly faced. That differential matters thermally. It means you lose heat faster, you need to store more of it, and the efficiency of your heating system has more direct survival implications. The Cachalofen's fundamental advantage, thermal mass stored heat, sustained radiation, is most valuable precisely in the coldest climates. The enclosed stove that keeps a Norwegian farmhouse at a survivable temperature through a night of -20 degrees Celsius is doing something categorically different from the open fireplace that provides pleasant warmth in a London drawing room on a damp November evening. The problem it is solving is harder, and the solution it developed is correspondingly more sophisticated. But climate alone does not fully explain the divergence. Because England and northern France are not warm countries, English winters are cold and damp and persistent, and yet the English and French emphatically did not adopt the enclosed tiled stove. They kept their open fireplaces, improved them incrementally, made them increasingly beautiful, and largely ignored the vastly more efficient alternative that existed a few hundred miles to their east. Why, I have thought about this question a great deal, and I think the most honest answer involves a combination of factors that are not purely rational. The visible flame mattered enormously to the English and French domestic imagination, in a way it apparently did not as much to the German and Scandinavian one. An enclosed stove hides the fire. You know it is burning inside. You can feel the warmth radiating from the ceramic tiles, but you cannot see the flame. You cannot watch it. The stove is warm but opaque, a functional object rather than a living presence in the room. The English fireplace, by contrast, puts the fire on display. The flame is visible, central, watchable, and as we have now established thanks to the neuroscience we will explore more fully later, watching fire does something specific and important to the human nervous system, something that a warm ceramic tile surface, however efficiently heated, does not replicate. There is also, I think, a class dimension that is worth acknowledging. The elaborate carved fireplace, as we discussed in the Renaissance chapter, was a status display. A Cachalofen, however beautiful its tiles, is fundamentally a utilitarian object. It heats efficiently, it is modest in its claims. The English and French aristocracy and merchant class were not in the 16th and 17th centuries particularly interested in modesty. They were interested in display. The fireplace was their stage. The Kachelofen offered warmth without spectacle, different priorities, different choices, different rooms. There is one more dimension of this story that I want to bring in because it adds a layer of irony that feels almost too perfect. During the 18th century, the Enlightenment period when Benjamin Franklin and Count Rumford were working on their fireplace improvements, several European intellectuals and natural philosophers who travelled between England and the German-speaking world noticed the efficiency gap with considerable alarm. The Swiss physician Samuel Auguste Tissot, writing in the 1760s, noted that the Swiss practice of heating rooms with enclosed tiled stoves produced healthier domestic environments than the English practice of open fireplaces. Less drafts, more consistent warmth, less fuel consumption. He was not the only observer to make this point. A number of English travellers returning from Germany and Switzerland recorded their astonishment at how warm and fuel-efficient German homes were compared to English ones, and yet England did not change. The tiled stove did not cross the channel in any meaningful way. When Franklin developed his enclosed stove, which was in conceptual terms closer to the Germanic tradition than to the English one, it found more success in continental Europe and America than in England itself, where the open fireplace remained culturally dominant. The English, it seems, were willing to be cold in a particular way rather than warm in a different way. I find that genuinely admirable in a completely impractical sense. In Scandinavia, meanwhile, the enclosed stove tradition was developing along its own distinctive lines. The Norwegian and Swedish variants built from soapstone rather than ceramic tile, because soapstone is abundant in Scandinavian geology and has even better thermal mass properties than ceramic-produced heating objects of extraordinary simplicity and effectiveness. Soapstone stoves have been found in Norwegian farmhouses dating back to the Viking Age. The material is soft enough to carve with iron tools, heat-resistant, and capable of absorbing and storing thermal energy with remarkable efficiency. A thick soapstone stove wall can hold heat for longer than almost any other readily available natural material. Scandinavian farmers understood this empirically, long before any scientist measured it precisely. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the Scandinavian soapstone stove had evolved into a mature, highly refined domestic technology. The great Norwegian soapstone stove manufacturers, some of whose companies survive to this day, still producing stoves that combine Viking-era material knowledge with modern engineering, were producing objects of genuine beauty alongside functional excellence. The stoves were typically simple in form, rectangular or slightly tapering towers of grey-green stone, but the quality of the material and the precision of the construction gave them a dignity that needed no ornament. A Scandinavian farmer in 1750 could heat his family's main room through the coldest Norwegian winter with a fraction of the wood that his English counterpart burned in a draughty wall fireplace. He could do it with a single firing per day. He could do it without filling the room with smoke, and he could do it with a device that would still be standing still functioning 200 years later. The Juttel Company, the Norwegian stove manufacturer I mentioned earlier in this story, was founded in 1853. It is by most reckonings one of the oldest continuously operating stove manufacturers in the world. Its current catalogue draws on design traditions that are centuries older than the company itself. When their stoves became fashionable in British and American homes in the 2000s and 2010s, it was not because Scandinavian design had suddenly invented something new. It was because design-conscious consumers in countries that had chosen the open fireplace tradition had finally belatedly discovered what the Norwegians had known for 1,000 years. The enclosed stove is better, more efficient, cleaner, more sustained, more practical in almost every measurable respect. It just does not let you watch the fire. And that, as we are beginning to understand more clearly with every chapter of this history, is the thing that some people simply cannot give up. Which brings us back to a thread I want to pick up again before we move forward. We have now spent several chapters with the Western European open fireplace tradition, its beauty, its inefficiency, its social meanings, its coal-burning Victorian apotheosis. And we have just spent this chapter with its more practical, more enclosed, more thermally intelligent counterpart to the east and north. Both traditions were shaped by the same fundamental question. Both arrived at genuinely different answers, and both answers are still alive today in the Rumford proportion masonry fireplace of a New England farmhouse and in the cast-iron Jotul stove of a Bergen living room, because both answers were responding to something real in human experience, the warmth you need, and the fire you want to watch. These two things have been in tension for the better part of 1,000 years of European heating history, and the story of how that tension played out in the 19th century in the coal-blackened cities and the ornate Victorian parlours and the slowly dying forests of industrial Europe is what brought us eventually to the catastrophic moment that changed everything. The moment when the smoke finally became impossible to ignore. That is exactly where we pick up next. Something happened in the middle of the 20th century that nobody had quite predicted. Not a war, though there had just been one. Not a famine, not a plague. Something quieter than any of those things, and in its own way more transformative for the daily texture of ordinary life than almost anything else that century produced. Central heating arrived in European homes, and with it came a grief that nobody had a word for. To understand how significant this transition was, you have to appreciate how suddenly it happened. For most of human history, for the entire sweep of the story we've been telling tonight, the fireplace was not one option among several. It was the only option. Every generation from the Iron Age forward had organised their domestic lives around a single fundamental constraint. If you want warmth, you must maintain a fire. That constraint shaped architecture, shaped family life, shaped social customs, shaped the entire emotional vocabulary of what it meant to be home. And then in the space of roughly one generation, the generation that came of age after the Second World War, that constraint was lifted. Almost overnight by historical standards. The technology itself was not new. Steam radiator heating had been available in large buildings since the mid-19th century. Hot water radiator systems had been installed in the homes of the very wealthy since the 1880s, but the combination of factors that made central heating genuinely affordable and accessible for ordinary middle-class European and American families, mass production of boilers and radiators, the availability of cheap fuel oil and natural gas, the expansion of gas distribution networks. The post-war housing boom that built millions of new homes equipped with heating systems from the start, all converged in the late 1940s, the 1950s, and the 1960s into something like a revolution. Britain in particular made a specific policy decision that accelerated the transition. The Great Smog of December 1952 is one of those historical events that sounds almost impossibly dramatic. In retrospect, 5 days, in which a combination of windless weather temperature inversion and the accumulated output of millions of coal fires blanketed London in a toxic fog so thick that people could not see their own hands held at arm's length in front of their faces. Buses stopped running because drivers could not see the road. Movie theatres closed mid-screening because the fog had penetrated indoors and the audience could not see the screen. The smell was described by survivors as a mixture of sulphur and rotting eggs that coated the back of the throat and would not wash out. The official death toll, initially reported as around 4,000, was revised upward by subsequent epidemiological studies to somewhere between 10,000 and 12,000 people, mostly elderly, mostly those with pre-existing respiratory conditions, mostly the poor who could not afford to stay indoors and keep warm by any means other than burning more coal. The Great Smog was not caused solely by domestic coal fires, industrial emissions, and the exhaust of diesel buses contributed. But domestic heating was identified as a primary factor, and the public reaction combined with the political pressure it generated produced the Clean Air Act of 1956 legislation that created smoke-free zones in British cities, effectively prohibiting the burning of smoky solid fuels in urban areas and accelerating the shift away from coal fireplaces toward cleaner alternatives. That act, more than any other single policy, marked the beginning of the end for the coal fire in British homes. Within 15 years of its passage, central heating had become the norm in new British housing. Within 25 years, the majority of existing homes had been retrofitted. The coal fire, that defining feature of British domestic life for 3 centuries, was on its way out. And then something unexpected happened. I want to tell you about a survey. A British survey conducted in the 1970s, roughly 20 years after the Great Smog, roughly a decade into the widespread adoption of central heating. Researchers were studying how people felt about their homes, what they missed, what they valued, what had changed in their experience of domestic life since the transition away from open fires. The responses were not what the researchers had expected. People were warm, they acknowledged that. They were consistently, reliably, uniformly warm in ways they had never been before. No more cold bedrooms in the morning, no more huddling in one room because it was the only heated space. No more rationing coal through February because the supply was running low, but a significant portion of respondents, particularly older people who had grown up with coal fires, but younger people too, people who had known nothing else, reported feeling that something was missing, something they could not quite name, a quality of the home environment that central heating provided warmth without providing. They described sitting in rooms that were technically warm but felt somehow less alive, less present, less like the rooms they remembered. Some of them described with a slight embarrassment that the researchers noted the habit of sitting in front of their gas or electric fires that were essentially decorative. At this point, fires they did not need for warmth and watching the flames. Just watching. Doing nothing else. Not reading. Not talking, just watching the fire, and they found it difficult to explain why this was satisfying. They knew it was not rational. They knew the central heating was doing the actual work, but they did it anyway. I find this survey and others like it that followed through the 1980s and 90s one of the most genuinely illuminating pieces of evidence in this entire history. Not because it tells us that people are irrational, but because it tells us that the fireplace was doing something in people's lives that had nothing to do with temperature, something that the thermostat and the radiator could not replace, something that was about the fire itself, the visible, moving, breathing, unpredictable, alive quality of actual flame. What was that something? The most rigorous scientific answer comes from research that only began to accumulate in the early 21st century, when neuroscientists and evolutionary psychologists started taking the question seriously. A researcher named Christopher Lynn, an anthropologist at the University of Alabama, published a study in 2015 examining the physiological effects of watching fire. His experiment was simple in design. Participants were asked to watch a video of a fireplace, real flames, the full crackling visual for varying periods of time. Their blood pressure was monitored throughout. A control group watched a video of a fireplace with the sound turned off. The results were clear. Watching and listening to a real fire caused a measurable decrease in blood pressure over time. The longer people watched, the more their blood pressure dropped. The effect was absent in the silent condition. Just the visual without the sound of crackling did not produce the same response. The combination of flickering light and the irregular, unpatterned sound of burning wood was what triggered the physiological relaxation response. Lynn's interpretation, grounded in evolutionary theory, was straightforward. Humans have been sitting around fires for somewhere between 1 and 2 million years. The sight and sound of a controlled fire is one of the most ancient signals of safety available to the human nervous system. It means warmth. It means the group is together. It means predators are kept at bay. It means food can be cooked. Everything is going to be all right. That signal is encoded deeply enough in human neurophysiology that it operates largely independently of conscious thought. You do not decide to find a fire relaxing. You simply find it relaxing the way you find certain musical intervals pleasant or certain facial expression trustworthy, because evolution has spent an enormous amount of time training your nervous system to respond that way. This research has been replicated and extended by other researchers in the years since. Studies have examined the effects of firelight on social behavior, finding that people in rooms with active fireplaces tend to stay longer, talk more, and report higher feelings of social connection than people in rooms heated to the same temperature by other means. Other research has looked at the role of fire watching in stress reduction, finding consistent results, suggesting that the irregular, unpredictable movement of flames engages attention in a way that is absorbing without being demanding, what some researchers call a soft fascination, a state of relaxed alertness that is associated with reduced stress hormones and improved mood. There is even a hypothesis, compelling but admittedly speculative, that fire watching may have played a role in the development of human language and storytelling. The anthropologist Polly Wiesner conducted fieldwork among the Juhuansi people of the Kalahari, studying how the content and character of social conversation changed between daytime and nighttime when people gathered around fires. She found that nighttime fireside conversations were dramatically more likely to involve storytelling, narrative, imagination, and emotional depth than daytime conversations. The fire, she argued, created a specific social and psychological context, relaxed, intimate, visually absorbing, that was uniquely conducive to the sharing of complex human experience through narrative. Which makes me think, if you are watching a storytelling channel at night, settling in to listen to a long story about history, there might be something very old and very wired in about why that feels right. You are, in a sense, doing exactly what your ancestors did around the fire, just without the fire. Or maybe if you have a candle lit somewhere nearby, or a fireplace video running in another window exactly with it. But let us come back to the 20th century, because the story of how Europeans responded to the disappearance of the fireplace is not just a story about neuroscience and evolution. It is a story about economics and culture, and a very interesting market for nostalgia. The gas fire, a heating appliance that burns natural gas through ceramic elements, designed to simulate the appearance of glowing coals or burning logs, was introduced in Britain in the late 19th century and became widely available in the 1920s and 30s. In the decades after the Second World War, as coal fires were phased out of urban homes, gas fires filled the gap left in the hearth opening. They were cleaner, more convenient, and safer than coal. You could turn them on and off with a knob. You did not need to lay kindling or carry coal scuttles or deal with ash. And they were almost universally considered by the people who bought them to be a somewhat inferior substitute for the real thing. Convenient, yes. Adequate, yes. But not quite right. The flames were regular, predictable, controlled the opposite of the unpredictable organic quality that made real fire compelling. A gas fire looked like fire in the way that a photograph of a sunset looks like a sunset. Recognizable, technically accurate, but missing whatever quality makes the real thing move you. The British relationship with the gas fire became a minor cultural joke through the 1970s and 80s. The gas fire in the rented flat with its fake plastic coals and its metered slot that you fed with coins. The gas fire in your nan's front room that she turned on only when visitors came because she did not want to use too much gas. The gas fire that was the first thing to be replaced when someone had enough money to renovate. And yet here is the thing, the fireplace opening itself was almost always preserved. Even when the gas fire was removed, the chimney breast remained. The mantelpiece stayed, the surround was kept. British homes by the million retained the architectural form of the fireplace long after any functional fire had occupied it, because the idea of blocking it up, filling it in, erasing it from the room that felt wrong to people in a way they found difficult to articulate. They were keeping the frame, even without the fire. Something shifted in the 1990s and accelerated rapidly into the 2000s. A cultural revaluation of the wood-burning stove that enclosed highly efficient continental European heating tradition that had developed separately from the British open fireplace reached critical mass in the United Kingdom and somewhat later in the United States. The numbers are quite striking. In Britain, sales of wood-burning stoves increased by something like 500% between 2000 and 2012. In 2014, the Stove Industry Alliance reported that approximately 175,000 wood-burning stoves were sold in the United Kingdom in that year alone. These were not being installed because people lacked central heating. Almost every home that bought a wood-burning stove in this period already had a perfectly functional central heating system. People were paying in many cases several £1,000s for the stove for the installation, for the liner to bring the old chimney up to modern safety standards to add a secondary, less efficient, more demanding heat source to a home that did not need it. They were paying for fire, not for heat, for fire. And simultaneously, something even more remarkable was happening online. In 2013, the Norwegian public broadcaster NRK aired a television program called National Firewood Night, a broadcast that consisted in its entirety of a camera fixed on a burning wood fire in a traditional Norwegian stove with no commentary, no music, no narrative, just the fire burning in real time for 8 hours. 750,000 Norwegians watched it. In a country of roughly 5 million people, that is 1 in every 6 or 7 people tuning in to watch a fire. NRK followed it up with a 12-hour train journey, filmed from the front of the train, a continuous slow boat trip along the Norwegian coast, and a continuous salmon fishing program. All of these slow television programs drew audiences that conventional programming executives found astonishing. But the Fireplace program started it, and the format spread globally. On YouTube, videos of crackling fire, static camera, real wood. No narration have accumulated hundreds of millions of views. Some individual videos have been watched more than 50 million times. There are entire channels devoted to nothing else. People put these videos on during Christmas, during dinner parties, while working from home, as background while they read or sleep or think. They are in essence using technology to reconstruct the experience of sitting by a fire, the soft irregular light, the unpatterned sound in homes where no actual fire burns. I find this one of the most quietly profound things about contemporary life. That after all of the technological progress, all of the engineering achievement, all of the hard-won improvements in air quality and heating efficiency and domestic safety, after all of that, we're still in our millions watching fire. Not for warmth, not for light, for something that the warmth and the light were always proxies for the oldest feeling in the human story, the feeling of being safe, gathered, together, at home. We're coming toward the end of this story now, but there is one final chapter that I want to spend some time with, because everything we have explored tonight, the smoke and the beauty, the engineering and the status, the suffering and the longing, comes together in a question that I think is genuinely worth asking. As we move into a future defined by climate consciousness, by the need to reduce carbon emissions, by the electrification of everything, what happens to the fireplace? What happens to the fire? Is the wood-burning stove an indulgence we can afford in a warming world? Is the gas fireplace a relic we should phase out? Or is there something about the human need for visible flame that deserves to be accommodated rather than engineered away? The answer, I think, is more nuanced and more hopeful than you might expect, and it involves some genuinely interesting innovations that honour both the ancient pull of fire and the modern imperative of sustainability. That is where we're going next. We ended the last chapter with a question hanging in the air. Not a comfortable question. The question of what we do individually, collectively as societies, when we know that something we love is causing harm, when the comfort we have built our lives around is also quietly destroying the air we breathe and the health of the people most vulnerable among us. Victorian Britain answered that question, as we saw, by largely continuing, by choosing warmth and fuel over clean air, by letting the coal fires burn for another generation, and then another, until the consequences accumulated to a point that was simply impossible to accommodate any further. That point came on the 5th of December 1952. And nothing about domestic heating in Europe was ever quite the same afterward. You have to understand the specific quality of London in the early 1950s to appreciate what happened that December. The city was exhausted. The Second World War had ended 7 years earlier, but rationing of food and fuel had continued well into the late 1940s. The housing stock was damaged, bomb sites still stood empty across the East End and in many other neighbourhoods. The population was growing, the economy was slowly recovering, and coal was still the primary domestic fuel for something like 11 million London homes. 11 million homes, all burning coal, every morning of every winter. The 5th of December brought weather conditions that the coal smoke had been waiting for. A high-pressure system settled over southeastern England, creating a temperature inversion, a layer of warmer air trapping the cold air near the ground. The wind dropped to almost nothing, and the smoke from those 11 million coal fires, instead of dispersing upward and outward, as it normally did, simply accumulated. Layer upon layer upon layer, building through the night and into the following day, and the day after that, until the air over London was not air in any meaningful sense anymore. Survivors describe walking through streets where visibility was measured in feet rather than yards, where the fog was not grey but yellow-green, a colour that people who witnessed it consistently struggled to describe, not quite any colour in the normal world, the colour of something wrong, where the smell of sulphur was physical, coating the throat and the back of the nose with every breath, where traffic stopped entirely because drivers could not see the front of their own vehicles, where people who ventured outside without covering their faces came home with black rims around their nostrils and the corners of their eyes. The fog lasted 5 days, and somewhere between 10,000 and 12,000 people died, not immediately in most cases, not in dramatic visible ways that would have made the connection unmistakable on the day. The excess deaths, the deaths above the statistical normal for that period, accumulated over the following weeks, as people with compromised lungs and damaged hearts, who might have survived another few years or another few months, did not. Hospital admissions spiked. Morgues ran out of space. The flower shops ran out of flowers for funerals. The official government response was initially to downplay. The first official estimate of excess deaths was around 4,000, significantly below what independent medical researchers were already calculating from hospital and mortality records. There was a political and economic reluctance to acknowledge the true scale of the disaster, because acknowledging it fully would have required acknowledging that the coal industry, the backbone of British energy, the employer of hundreds of thousands, the fuel of the post-war recovery, was killing people in their own homes. But the evidence was too clear to suppress indefinitely. The epidemiologists kept counting. The medical journals kept publishing. And 4 years after the Great Smog of December 1952, Parliament passed the Clean Air Act of 1956. It was the most significant piece of domestic environmental legislation Britain had ever produced, and it was in ways that went far beyond its immediate environmental purpose. The death certificate of the coal fire as a feature of ordinary British domestic life. The Clean Air Act created designated smoke control areas in urban neighbourhoods, areas in which the burning of smoky solid fuels was prohibited. It provided grants to help homeowners convert their coal fireplaces to gas or electric heating. It set emissions standards for domestic fires that open coal burning simply could not meet. The conversion happened remarkably quickly, given how deeply embedded coal heating was in British domestic culture. Within a decade of the Act's passage, gas fires had replaced coal fires in millions of urban homes. Within 2 decades, central heating systems gas boilers connected to radiators in each room were being installed in new housing as standard. Within 3 decades, the coal fire that had dominated British domestic life since the 17th century was in most urban areas effectively gone. The sky over London changed visibly within years. The specific yellow-green winter fog, the pea souper, the particular that had been a defining feature of London's atmosphere for 3 centuries, immortalised in Dickens and Conan Doyle, and hundreds of Victorian paintings and photographs simply disappeared. By the early 1970s, a London winter morning looked like a winter morning. Grey, sometimes damp often, but the air was breathable. The buildings were beginning slowly to show their original stone colours again, rather than the universal black coating of accumulated soot. Claude Monet's luminous, fog-dissolved London paintings, those extraordinary works we discussed earlier, became historical documents of a world that no longer existed. The city he had painted with such wonder in 1900 was gone by 1970. Its atmosphere had been cleaned. The beauty he had seen in the pollution was not coming back. I find that bittersweet in a way I cannot fully resolve. The fog was harmful. Its disappearance was an unambiguous improvement in the lives and health of millions of people, and yet something visually atmospherically extraordinary went with it. The specific quality of light that Monet captured, that amber-grey diffusion, that dissolution of solid forms into coloured mist, was inseparable from the coal smoke that was killing people. You cannot have one without the other. Some things are beautiful and terrible simultaneously. The honest response to that is not to choose one truth over the other, but to hold both. Now here is where the story takes the turn that I find most psychologically interesting. Central heating, gas boilers, radiators, thermostats arrived in British homes not as a luxury but as a practical replacement for something that was being phased out by law and by economics. It was not primarily a choice. It was for millions of households a necessity presented as an upgrade. And by most measurable standards it was an upgrade. The homes were warmer, more consistently warm. Warm in every room, not just the kitchen and the sitting room. Warm in the morning without anyone having to get up first to lay a fire. Warm at a temperature you could set and forget, with no soot, no ash, no coal scuttle, to carry no chimney sweep, to arrange no newspaper to crumple for kindling. Every single one of those improvements was real and meaningful. I do not want to romanticize the coal fire by making central heating sound like a loss. It was not purely a loss. It was for most people a genuine improvement in physical comfort and domestic convenience. But the surveys we discussed in the previous chapter, those studies from the 1970s and 80s showing that people in centrally heated homes missed the fire, missed gathering, missed the specific quality of presence that a visible flame provided, those surveys were documenting something real. And it was not just nostalgia. It was a recognition, often inarticulate but persistent, that something structural had changed in the experience of being at home. When the fire was the centre of the room had a centre. Furniture was arranged in relation to it. Conversation happened around it. The family oriented themselves toward a shared focal point. The room had in architectural and psychological terms a heart. When the radiator replaced the fire, the room lost its centre. The heat came from the walls from every direction, from no particular direction. The room was warm but directionless. Furniture could be arranged any way. There was no focal point unless you created one artificially with a television perhaps, or a decorative arrangement of some kind. The television, as it happened, stepped into the focal point role with remarkable efficiency. The 1950s and 60s, which saw both the rapid spread of central heating and the rapid spread of television ownership in British homes, produced a new domestic arrangement. The family gathered in the living room, not around a fire but around a screen. The focal point had migrated. The gathering instinct remained, but the thing being gathered around had changed its nature entirely. I think about that substitution a great deal. The fire was a two-way relationship. It was alive, it responded to conditions it required, tending it could go out if you neglected it. Watching a fire was participatory in a way that watching television was not. The fire asked something of you. The screen gave you something without asking anything in return. That is not a simple judgment about television. Television has its own extraordinary qualities and its own legitimate place in domestic culture. But as a replacement for the psychological function of the fire, as a focal point for family gathering that also produced genuine engagement rather than passive consumption, it is, I think, worth noting as an imperfect substitute. Outside Britain, the transition followed different paths and different timelines, but the direction was broadly similar across Western Europe. In France, the centralisation of gas distribution through the Gaz de France network in the post-war decades made gas heating increasingly affordable and accessible, and the traditional French fireplace, those magnificent but draughty creations we discussed in the Renaissance and the 18th century chapters, gave way to gas radiators and eventually to the central boiler systems that still heat most French apartments today. In Germany and Scandinavia, the transition was more complex. The enclosed stove tradition that had served those cultures so well for centuries did not disappear so readily. Gas and oil central heating systems were widely adopted for their convenience, but the wood-burning stove maintained a cultural foothold, particularly in rural areas and in the homes of people who valued the specific quality of stove-heated warmth, which differs subtly and noticeably from radiator warmth. The Scandinavian countries never fully abandoned the stove, and that cultural continuity would prove significant when the late 20th century began its reassessment of what domestic warmth should feel like. In Germany, the Kachelofen tradition, the tiled stove we spent time with earlier in this chapter, found renewed appreciation as both a heritage object and a practical heating supplement during the energy crises of the 1970s, when the sudden increase in oil prices made fuel efficiency suddenly very relevant again. Families who had inherited old Kachelofens from grandparents began using them seriously again. The tiled stove workshops that had survived as craft businesses for decorative restoration work found themselves with new practical commissions. Energy crisis, it turns out, is good for thermal efficiency, which is worth keeping in mind. There is one more development from the mid-20th century that I want to mention before we move forward, because it represents one of the stranger footnotes in the history of the fireplace's decline and eventual partial rehabilitation. In the 1950s and 60s, as coal fireplaces were being removed from British homes and replaced with gas fires and eventually central heating systems, a remarkable number of Victorian and Edwardian fireplace surrounds were simply thrown away. Marble mantles, cast iron inserts, decorative tile surrounds, objects that had been crafted with considerable skill and artistry, that were sometimes genuinely beautiful, that represented the accumulated decorative achievement of Victorian manufacturing culture, all of them ripped out and dumped. The architectural salvage industry, which today does a brisk business in precisely these objects, was not yet large enough or organised enough to save most of them. Builders and homeowners removing fireplaces in the 60s modernisation wave were for the most part not thinking about preservation. They were thinking about progress, about clean lines, about the modern aesthetic of smooth walls and hidden heating systems. The irony is that by the 1990s, those same Victorian fireplace surrounds the ones that had survived in salvage yards or in houses that had not yet been modernised were selling for significant sums to people who wanted to restore precisely the domestic quality that the 60s had so efficiently removed. The wheel once again turning. So here is where we stand at the end of the 20th century as the story prepares for its final movement. The coal fire is gone from European cities, the air is cleaner, the homes are warmer and more evenly heated than at any point in the history of this story. The Clean Air Act of 1956 and its successors across Europe have prevented an unknowable number of deaths from respiratory disease. And yet people are restless. They are warm, but something is missing. They are filling their houses with candles. They are installing decorative fireplaces they do not need. They are in increasing numbers buying wood-burning stoves and asking their local council whether their chimney is still functional. They are watching in their millions videos of fires on screens. The fire that we spent centuries trying to control, clean, and eventually replace has refused quietly, persistently, commercially, neurologically to be replaced. And what happens next, what the 21st century does with this ancient refusal, is the most hopeful and most honest chapter of this entire story. That is where we are going right now. We need to talk about something that I think gets missed in most histories of home heating. Not the engineering, not the architecture, not the politics of coal or the legislation about chimney sweeps or the science of combustion. All of that matters, and we have spent considerable time with it tonight. What gets missed is the interior experience, the psychological experience, what it actually felt like inside a human mind, inside a human body, to live through the most dramatic transition in the history of domestic warmth, to be the generation that grew up with a coal fire in every room, and then watch central heating arrive, watch the fireplaces get boarded up one by one, watch the terraced houses of Britain and the apartments of France and the row houses of Germany slowly seal over the openings that had been the literal and symbolic hearts of those homes for 300 years. What did that feel like? And why does it still matter to us right now in the 21st century, in ways that continue to shape how we design our homes, how we spend our money, and what we reach for when we want to feel safe? Let me take you to a specific moment, a specific place. The winter of 1947 in Britain was one of the coldest in recorded history. The temperature in many parts of England did not rise above freezing for weeks at a time. Snow fell in late January and lay on the ground unmelted until March. The Thames froze over at Windsor. Sheep were buried alive in snowdrifts in Wales and Yorkshire. Coal stocks, already depleted by the demands of the post-war recovery, ran critically short. The government imposed electricity cuts of up to 5 hours a day. Factories closed. Unemployment spiked. The country, exhausted from 6 years of war and already living under severe rationing, faced a winter that seemed almost deliberately personally cruel. And in households across Britain, people managed. The way people had always managed. They gathered in the one room with a working fireplace. They wore their coats indoors. They put hot water bottles in the beds and extra blankets over the coats already laid over the blankets. They made tea constantly, because a warm cup of tea is one of the most effective small technologies for surviving cold that human civilization has produced. And they sat together close to the fire and they waited for spring. I mention 1947, not because it was a pivotal year in the history of heating technology. It was not particularly, but because it represents the last time that most ordinary British families experienced cold in the ancient way. Communal cold, the cold that drives people together into the same room around the same fire, the cold that makes warmth a shared achievement rather than a private convenience. Because within a decade of that winter, central heating began its rapid spread through British homes, and once it arrived, it changed not just the temperature of houses, but the way families moved through them. When every room is the same temperature, there is no longer any reason to gather. No gravitational pull toward a single warm centre. Each person can be comfortable in their own space. Children retreat to their bedrooms, parents to their separate rooms. The family disperses through the house in a way that would have been physically impossible, genuinely impossible, not just uncomfortable but impossible in a home heated only by a coal fire. Sociologists and family researchers who have studied domestic behaviour across the 20th century have noted this pattern with some consistency. The introduction of central heating into family homes correlates with measurable changes in how families spend their time together, more time in separate rooms, less time in shared communal spaces, the kitchen and the living room becoming less central to daily domestic life, as the warmth that had concentrated family activity around them was distributed evenly throughout the house. I want to be careful here because I am not making a simple nostalgic argument that the old way was better. It was not. Cold bedrooms and frozen wash basins and children waking up to find ice on the inside of their windows are not charming. They are miserable. The freedom that central heating gave people, freedom from the constraint of the single heated room, freedom to read in their own beds, freedom to move through their homes without planning every movement around proximity to the fire, that freedom is real and genuinely valuable. But freedom, as the economists say, always has a cost. And the cost of thermal freedom was at least in part a certain kind of togetherness. A forced togetherness, yes, a togetherness born of necessity rather than choice, but togetherness nonetheless. Now here is where the story turns in a direction I find genuinely surprising. If the transition to central heating had simply made fireplaces obsolete, if people had responded to the removal of the functional fire with a shrug and a quiet gratitude for the improvement in comfort, then this part of the history would be brief and unremarkable. Useful old technology replaced by better technology. The end. But that is not what happened. What happened instead is that the fireplace refused to die, not functionally. Functionally, it was effectively dead as a primary heating source in most European and American homes by the 1970s and 80s. But culturally, symbolically, commercially, it was more alive than it had been in a century. The figures are worth sitting with. In the United States, the National Association of Home Builders reported in 2014 that fireplaces were among the top 3 most desired features in new home construction, ranking alongside master bathroom suites and walk-in closets. Roughly half of all new single-family homes built in the United States in the 2000s and 2010s included at least one fireplace or fireplace-style feature. Not because those homes needed the heat, because the buyers wanted the fire. In Britain, the story is almost a perfect inversion of what you might expect from a country that spent the 1950s and 60s desperately trying to phase out its coal fires. By 2010, the fireplace had become one of the most powerful selling points in residential real estate. Estate agents, that is British for real estate agents, consistently reported that properties with original working fireplaces commanded a premium of between 5 and 15% over comparable properties without them. A Victorian terraced house in London, with its original marble fireplace surround intact, sold noticeably faster and for more money than the same house with the fireplace removed or filled in. People were paying a literal, measurable, financially significant premium to live near a fire they did not need. And the home renovation industry noticed. The 1990s and 2000s saw a boom in fireplace restoration businesses in Britain. Companies whose entire business model was built around finding Victorian and Edwardian fireplace surrounds in architectural salvage yards and reinstalling them in houses from which they had been removed during the utilitarian renovations of the 60s and 70s. The irony is almost too neat. The 60s stripped out fireplaces because they were old-fashioned and impractical. The 90s and 2000s paid to put them back in because they were original and characterful. The same fireplace, removed, reinstalled, the wheel turning. I want to ask you something here, and I genuinely want you to think about it for a second. Have you ever been in a room with a real fire burning a wood fire or even a well-made gas fire with actual visible flames and noticed how the social dynamics of the room change? How people orient themselves toward it almost automatically? How conversations seem to flow differently, more slowly, more intimately? How it becomes harder to look at your phone? I have noticed this. I notice it every time, and I do not think it is imagination or nostalgia or the romanticization of something simply because it is old. I think it is the neuroscience we discussed earlier in this story, operating exactly as advertised, the ancient safety signal doing its work on nervous systems that have not changed in any fundamental way since our ancestors gathered around fires on the African savanna. And here is what I find most interesting about that observation in a contemporary context. We live in an era defined in many ways by the difficulty of sustained attention, by the fragmentation of experience into small pieces, each one competing for the limited resource of human focus, by the extraordinary capability of our devices to deliver an endless stream of novel stimuli, each one calibrated to demand our attention, and then immediately release it in favor of the next thing. In that context, the fireplace is interesting precisely because of what it is not. It is not novel. It is not interactive. It does not update. It does not notify. It does not compete for attention with a strategy or an algorithm. It simply burns. Irregularly, unpredictably, in the same way it has burned for the entire history of our species. And yet, people watch it, willingly, for extended periods. People who cannot sit through a 5-minute video without checking their phone will sit in front of a fire for an hour without reaching for it. The fire apparently is one of the few things that compete successfully with the algorithm, not by being more stimulating, by being differently stimulating, slowly, softly, in a way that satisfies without exhausting. A Danish concept that became popular in English-speaking countries during the 2010s, the word hygge, roughly translated as a quality of coziness and comfortable conviviality, centers almost invariably in Danish domestic practice on the presence of candlelight or firelight. The concept is difficult to translate not because Danish culture is mysterious, but because English-speaking cultures had largely engineered out the physical conditions that give rise to it. You cannot really achieve hygge under bright LED lighting with a thermostat-controlled radiator doing the heating. You need the fire, or at least its closest available substitute. The fact that hygge became a global publishing phenomenon in the mid-2010s with dozens of books, hundreds of magazine articles, and entire lifestyle brands built around the concept is, I think, a piece of cultural evidence worth taking seriously. It suggests that a large number of people in modern post-industrial societies feel a lack of something, a quality of domestic experience that their technically well-heated, well-lit, well-connected homes are not providing. A quality that when they encounter a word for it in another language immediately resonates as something they recognize and want. That quality is, I would argue, essentially ancient. It is the quality of gathered warmth around a shared light. The design world responded to this longing with a range of solutions that span from the deeply authentic to the magnificently absurd. At the authentic end of the spectrum, the renaissance of the wood-burning stove, which we touched on earlier, driven partly by nostalgia, partly by genuine environmental calculation. Modern high-efficiency wood-burning stoves, the kind certified to current European emission standards, burning dry seasoned wood at high temperatures with carefully controlled airflow, are in fact quite environmentally defensible compared to their Victorian coal-burning predecessors. They produce dramatically less particulate matter than open fireplaces. They are significantly more efficient at converting fuel to heat, and if the wood they burn is sourced from sustainably managed forests, they can be effectively carbon neutral over their life cycle in a way that gas and oil simply cannot be. The Scandinavian countries, which had never really abandoned the enclosed wood-burning stove as a cultural institution, found themselves unexpectedly at the forefront of a global trend. Norwegian and Swedish stove manufacturers, companies producing beautifully designed, highly efficient stoves in cast iron and soapstone, saw export demand surge dramatically through the 2000s and 2010s. The Juttel Company, a Norwegian manufacturer with roots going back to 1853, reported significant growth in markets outside Scandinavia, particularly in the United Kingdom and the United States, where their products became almost status symbols for a certain kind of design-conscious, environmentally aware consumer. At the slightly less authentic end of the spectrum, the bioethanol fireplace, a genuinely interesting development and one worth understanding. Bioethanol is a liquid fuel produced from plant matter, typically sugarcane, corn, or agricultural waste. When burned, it produces heat, water vapor, and carbon dioxide, but essentially no particulate matter and no sulfur compounds. No chimney required, no flue, no installation beyond placing the burner in a suitable opening or freestanding frame. Bioethanol fireplaces produce real flames, beautiful, clean, quietly dancing flames that respond to air currents in the room, with exactly the organic unpredictability that makes fire compelling. They can be installed anywhere on a wall, in a coffee table, in a freestanding sculpture in the middle of a room. They became fashionable in contemporary interior design from about 2005 onward, particularly in apartments and urban homes where traditional chimney infrastructure did not exist. The criticism of bioethanol fireplaces, and it is a legitimate one, is that they are primarily aesthetic objects. They produce a modest amount of heat, but their primary function is the flame itself. They are essentially an admission that we want fire for its own sake, divorced from any pretense of practical necessity, which is, depending on your perspective, either wonderfully honest or vaguely decadent. I find them wonderful personally. I think there is something clarifying about a technology that simply says this is what it is. You want to watch fire? Here is fire. No pretense about heating your home with it. No elaborate justification. Just the flame for the flame's sake, because the flame does something to you that nothing else does. Then there are the electric fireplaces devices that use light-emitting diodes and carefully engineered optics to simulate the appearance of flames without any combustion at all. The technology has improved dramatically since the early unconvincing models of the 1980s and 90s. Contemporary high-end electric fireplaces use multiple layers of illuminated translucent material, randomly varying light patterns, and sometimes actual physical movement to create an effect that in the right conditions is quite persuasive. They produce zero emissions, require no ventilation, and can be installed in any room with an electrical outlet. They are also, as anyone who has spent more than a few minutes near one can attest, not quite the same as real fire. Something in the regularity, the slight artificiality of the movement, the absence of warmth radiating from the direction of the flame, something registers as not right. The ancient circuitry that recognizes fire apparently also recognizes the absence of fire, even when the visual simulation is technically competent, which tells you something quite interesting about the depth of what we are actually seeking when we want a fire. It is not purely visual, it is multi-sensory, multimodal, and it involves a kind of physical reality, actual combustion, actual radiant heat, actual acoustic irregularity that simulation struggles to fully replicate. So where does that leave us? Here we are in the early 21st century in homes that are warmer and safer and cleaner than any homes in human history. We have solved by any practical measure the problem that preoccupied our ancestors, from the first human fire in a cave to the last coal fire boarded up in a British terrace house in 1968. We have solved it, and then we have spent decades and billions of dollars trying to get back some version of what we had before we solved it. Not the cold, not the smoke, not the climbing boys or the pea soupers or the chronic bronchitis. We do not miss those things, and we should not pretend to. What we miss, what we keep reaching for in wood-burning stoves and bioethanol flames and Norwegian slow television and candles and Higgy and Fireplace videos with 50 million views, is the presence of living fire, the specific quality of light and sound and warmth that only actual combustion produces, the experience of something real and alive and slightly beyond our control sharing the room with us. And I think that longing is worth respecting rather than dismissing. It is not nostalgia for discomfort. It is a recognition of something genuine about human experience, something that 2 million years of evolutionary history have written into us so deeply that central heating and smart thermostats and underfloor heating and all the rest cannot simply overwrite it. The fire in some form will keep coming back because we keep calling it back, and that truth, that persistent, stubborn, irrational and yet completely rational truth, is what this entire history has been circling toward from the very beginning. We are coming to the last chapter now, the final piece of this story. And it is the piece that for me personally makes everything that came before it feel not just interesting but important, because the question of what we do with fire from here, in a world that genuinely needs to reduce emissions, that genuinely faces environmental consequences from combustion, that genuinely has to make hard choices about what we burn and how and why, is not a historical question. It is a present one. It is happening right now. And the answer we give to it will be shaped, whether we know it or not, by everything we have explored tonight. What does humanity owe the fire? What does the fire owe us? And what does a truly honest, truly thoughtful 21st century relationship with flame actually look like? That is where we are going, right now. We've been on a long journey tonight, from a dirt floor in Iron Age Europe with smoke curling toward a hole in the thatch, through the hidden engineering marvel beneath a Roman villa's warm mosaic floor, through the medieval Great Hall and its central hearth, where an entire household slept and ate and argued and grieved and laughed within the radius of a single fire, through the chimneys of Norman castles and the carved marble mantles of Renaissance palaces and the ornate cast-iron surrounds of Victorian parlours, through the coal smoke that turned London yellow and the climbing boys who kept the flues clean, and the scientists who spent their careers trying to make a hole in a wall burn wood more efficiently. And we ended last time with a question. What does a truly honest 21st century relationship with fire actually look like? I have been sitting with that question for a while, and I want to give it the answer it deserves. Start with this fact because I think it reframes everything that follows. The average European home today uses roughly 60 to 70% less energy for heating per square metre than it did in 1970. Not because Europeans are colder in their homes, because the homes themselves have been transformed. Insulation standards that were essentially non-existent before the 1970s are now mandatory across most of the European Union. Double and triple glazed windows have replaced the single pane glass that made Victorian and Edwardian rooms hemorrhage heat. Cavity wall insulation, roof insulation, underfloor insulation, layers of materials that the medieval builder never had access to, now do quietly and invisibly what thousands of hours of firewood and coal burning once tried and largely failed to do. The house itself has become the heating system, or at least a very significant part of it. That shift matters enormously to the fire story because it changes the terms of the conversation. When a house leaks heat from every surface, when every window is a cold radiator, every uninsulated wall, a slow drain on the warmth inside, you need a powerful, continuously burning heat source just to maintain a tolerable temperature. That was the situation for most of European domestic history. The fire had to be large and constant because the building it inhabited was by modern standards almost entirely uninsulated. But in a well-insulated modern home, the thermal demands on any heating source are dramatically reduced. A modern passive house built to the rigorous passive house standard developed in Germany in the late 1980s requires so little additional heat that the body warmth of the people living in it, combined with the waste heat from cooking and appliances, can keep it at a comfortable temperature through much of the winter, with almost no dedicated heating at all. The passive house standard, originally considered an extreme and somewhat eccentric position in the housing industry, has now influenced building codes across Europe and is spreading to North America and beyond. In that context, a home that barely needs heating, the wood-burning stove or the bioethanol fire or the carefully designed decorative fireplace is not a heating system. It is something else. It is what I would call an intentional experience, a deliberate chosen encounter with fire undertaken not because you have no alternative, but because you want it, because you know what it does to you, and you have decided that it is worth having. And I think that is actually a more honest relationship with fire than anything our ancestors had. They did not choose fire. They had no choice. The fire was necessity, compulsion, survival. There was no opting out. We can opt out. We have the insulation and the heat pumps and the underfloor hydronic systems and the smart thermostats. We can be warm without fire. And the fact that so many of us still choose to have some form of real flame in our homes, not because we need it, but because we want it, is a kind of clarity about what the fire actually means to us that previous generations never had the luxury of achieving. But the environmental question is real, and I do not want to smooth over it with sentiment. Wood smoke is not clean. Even the best modern wood-burning stoves produce particulate matter, fine particles that penetrate deep into lung tissue and are associated with cardiovascular and respiratory disease. Studies conducted by environmental health researchers in cities like London and Oslo and Zurich have found that wood smoke from domestic stoves contributes a disproportionate share of urban air pollution relative to the number of stoves in use. In some urban areas during winter, evenings wood smoke can account for more than half of all particulate air pollution, despite the fact that wood-burning stoves heat a small fraction of the total housing stock. This is a genuine tension, and it is one that policymakers across Europe are actively grappling with. Several cities have already moved to restrict or ban the use of wood-burning stoves on high-pollution days. The city of Paris implemented restrictions on wood burning during pollution episodes. Parts of California have had similar rules for years. London is considering tightening its regulations significantly. The wood-burning stove industry has responded with genuinely impressive engineering. The newest generation of certified stoves operating at combustion temperatures above 600 degrees Celsius, with carefully controlled secondary air supplies that burn off the volatile compounds before they leave the firebox, produces particulate emissions that are a small fraction of what older stoves or open fireplaces generated. Some manufacturers claim their latest models are cleaner in terms of particulate output than burning candles in a closed room. Whether those claims survive independent scrutiny is something researchers continue to debate, but the direction of travel is clear. The stove industry has accepted that clean combustion is the price of survival, and the engineering has followed. And then there is the genuinely new frontier, the technologies that honor the human need for fire while rethinking what fire actually has to be. The bioethanol fire, which we touched on last time, continues to evolve. Second and third generation bioethanol burners are significantly more controlled than the early models. They have automatic ignition, electronic flame regulation, and safety systems that monitor combustion quality continuously. Some premium models can be connected to home automation systems and controlled by smartphone. You can schedule your fire, which is either a wonderful marriage of ancient and modern, or a slightly absurd concept depending on your aesthetic sensibilities. Personally, I find it charming. Scheduling your fire feels very 21st century in the best possible way. More interesting to my mind is the development of hydrogen-burning fires. Hydrogen combustion produces water vapor and heat, nothing else. No carbon dioxide, no particulate matter, no sulfur compounds. A hydrogen flame is in the strictest sense as clean as fire can possibly get. Several European energy companies have been experimenting with hydrogen-blended gas supplies that could flow through existing gas infrastructure, allowing existing gas fireplaces and stoves to burn a progressively cleaner fuel without replacement. The visual quality of a hydrogen flame is somewhat different from a natural gas or wood flame. It burns with a paler, more transparent quality, but designers are working on burner configurations that produce the warm amber tones we associate with traditional fire. The goal, in other words, is to preserve the experience of fire, the light, the movement, the warmth, the sound, while transforming what is actually happening at the chemical level into something that leaves no harmful trace. It is in a sense the culmination of everything Benjamin Thompson Count Rumford was trying to achieve in his London workshops in the 1790s. Take the fire, make it work better, reduce the waste, keep the warmth and the light, just perhaps more so than even Rumford could have imagined. I want to spend the last few minutes of tonight not with technology but with something harder to measure. Throughout this entire story, from the first fire on an Iron Age floor to the Norwegian slow television broadcast of a burning stove, there is a thread I've been following that I want to name explicitly now. Fire is the oldest shared experience in human history. Not the oldest human experience. Hunger and thirst and love and fear are older, or at least as old, but the oldest shared experience. The one that from the earliest evidence of controlled fire somewhere between 1 and 2 million years ago consistently gathered people together rather than separating them. The one that created over hundreds of thousands of years the specific conditions, warmth, light, safety, stillness, in which human beings learn to tell stories to each other. There is a hypothesis held by several anthropologists and evolutionary biologists that the campfire was not merely incidental to the development of human language and complex social cognition. It was formative. The conditions of the evening fire, the extended, relaxed, visually occupied but physically still gathering in the dark, created a window of social time that did not exist in the same way during the active foraging vigilant daytime hours, and in that window something happened to human communication. It deepened, it extended, it moved from the practical, the immediate coordination of food finding and danger avoidance, into the narrative, the speculative, the imaginative. Stories, in other words. If this hypothesis is even partially correct, and I find it persuasive though, it is admittedly difficult to prove, then the history of the fireplace is not just a history of heating technology. It is a history of the conditions that made us who we are. That made us the kind of creature that tells stories about the past to make sense of the present, that gathers in the evening and shares experience and builds out of shared narrative the fragile and precious thing we call culture. Every technological change in this history, every chimney, every fireback, every Franklin stove, every Rumford redesign, every Victorian cast iron insert, every modern bioethanol burner was an attempt to preserve and improve the conditions under which that gathering could happen. To keep people warm enough to stay together, to clear the air enough that they could breathe easily. to make the fire safe enough that the gathering could be relaxed rather than anxious. We were always trying across this entire history to make the fire better, more reliable, more comfortable, less dangerous, more beautiful, because the fire and the gathering around it was always worth making better. Here is a thought I want to leave you with because I find it quietly moving in a way I cannot quite shake. Right now, at this exact moment, as you're listening to this, there are fires burning in homes all over the world. Wood fires in Norwegian mountain cabins, gas fires in English sitting rooms, bioethanol flames in Parisian apartments, open hearths in rural homes in places where the old technology never quite gave way to the new. Somewhere right now, people are sitting near these fires, not because they need to, because they want to, because after everything, after 2 million years of evolution, and 6,000 years of civilization, and all of the extraordinary engineering ingenuity documented in this story, they still find, as their ancestors always found, that a fire makes a room feel like home, and somewhere else right now, in a room with no fire, with perfect central heating, maintaining a perfect temperature in perfect flameless silence, someone is watching a video of a crackling fire on their television screen. Because they feel, without quite knowing why, that something is missing. That the warm, comfortable, safe room they're sitting in is missing a quality they cannot name but definitely recognize. Both of those people are right. The person at the fire and the person watching the fire on a screen are both honoring the same ancient instinct. The instinct that says light in the darkness matters. Gathered warmth matters. The presence of something alive and warm at the center of the home matters. We do not maintain fires for the same reasons our ancestors did. We're not afraid of the cold in the same way. We're not dependent on the fire for our survival, but we are still moved by it, still drawn to it, still in some deep and reliable part of our human architecture, made more fully ourselves in its presence. That, I think, is the final truth of this history, not a technological truth, not an architectural truth, a human truth. The fire was never just about staying warm, it was about staying together, and that is a need so fundamental, so ancient, so written into what we are that no amount of engineering progress will ever fully replace it. Well, that is our story for tonight. From the smoke-filled longhouses of Iron Age Europe to the clean bioethanol flames of the modern apartment, from the hypocaust hidden under Roman villa's floor to the smartphone-controlled fireplace of the 21st century, from the freezing great halls of medieval castles to the perfectly heated, fire-longing living rooms of our own time. What a journey it has been. I genuinely love this subject. I've spent more time than I'm willing to admit, reading about fireplace design history and Victorian chimney legislation, and the neuroscience of fire gazing, and I hope some of that love has come through tonight. These are not just stories about buildings and fuel and technology, they are stories about us, about what we need and what we fear and what we reach for when the world gets cold and dark. If this is your first time here, thank you for spending this evening with me. If you have been here before, thank you for coming back. These long, quiet, unhurried histories are my favourite thing to make, and knowing that people find something in them worth listening to is genuinely one of the things I'm most grateful for. If you enjoyed tonight's journey, consider sharing it with someone who might find it meaningful, a friend who loves history, a family member who asks questions about where things come from, anyone who has ever sat in front of a fire and felt, without quite knowing why, that was exactly where they needed to be. Leave a comment if there is a part of this story that stayed with you. Tell me which detail surprised you most, or just tell me whether you have a fireplace and whether you use it or miss it, or have one of those fireplace videos running on a loop somewhere in your house. I genuinely want to know. There are many more stories waiting. Stories about the history of other things we take entirely for granted, the objects and systems and invisible architectures of daily life. that shaped who we are in ways we almost never stop to notice. Each one a journey like this one, long and quiet and full of things worth knowing. Sleep well tonight, stay warm, and I will see you in the next one.